Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is July the 31st, 2022, and we are here to talk about current events, foreign policy, economics, history, and the world. If you have any questions for Mr. Agent Smith, tag me in the chat or whoever wants to help handle questions as we carry on. Without further ado, we join Mr. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo!
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm trying to manage this heat wave. It's supposed to end tomorrow. But it's a nice 90 degrees here in Seattle, Washington. Which is not supposed to be 90 degrees here, but it has been for the past 2 years. We have these new weather events called heat domes, where it's like a bunch of high pressure hot air goes over the Puget Sound and kind of just sticks there like a bubble. And the Pacific Ocean normally blows the warm air east, but it's too stuck, so it'll stick here for like a week.
Oh, well, that must be uncomfortable.
Yeah, the difference up here is most homes and apartments and things don't have air conditioning.
Yeah.
I know down in Texas it's hotter there than it is here, but AC is the mainstay of a Texas home.
It is indeed.
I think we mentioned that once a while back, that there was a big population boom in Texas whenever AC was invented and put into a lot of homes.
Yeah, the Sun Belt in general.
Yeah.
All the hot places kind of got a decent population bump after AC was invented because it was actually tolerable to live here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it started like 50s, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
1950s or so. Somewhere around there.
Yeah, chat's saying they've started giving heat waves names, kind of like how we name hurricanes. I don't remember if we did that in the past.
I don't think so. I think that's a newer thing they're doing to kind of raise awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it would work here in Texas.
Yeah.
You'd only need one name per year, pretty much.
Yeah, it's pretty consistently hot in Texas. It's more interesting for areas that haven't historically been hot that are getting these crazy heat waves. Texans are pretty hardened by it. Like they're aware that their summers are brutal and hot, and that's part of the deal.
Yeah. Well, is the government up there going to do anything about it?
They issue warnings and tell people what you're supposed to do for heat advisory. I don't think the government can do anything per se for your average person. The thing that's a question mark for me is, are they going to make central air more of a thing for homes up here moving forward? Because I would think that would be a major selling point if they do. Like if you have an apartment that doesn't have AC and one that does, the one that does has a major selling point. So we'll see where that goes. For this week, the main news item that people are already asking about in the chat, and I've seen a bunch of other streamers talking about, is Taiwan and the banter between Chinese officials and the Speaker of the House going on her trip to Asia, and lots of very strong words, but also vague words, kind of veiled threats, that kind of a thing. What's the situation over there?
Same, it's the status quo.
Yeah.
They like to issue warnings and, try to look big. And then the United States will try to do this, that, or the other in response. But, yeah, there's no real change there. The only reason people kind of have started bringing it up again is because Nancy Pelosi announced that she was going to take a trip to Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And, it hasn't been unusual for government officials from the U.S. to travel to Taiwan, especially in the past year. The Chinese government always makes noises about being upset about it, but, they don't really do much about it other than, buzzing Taiwan's airspace or some such. Basically just performative upset, basically. But Nancy Pelosi is more high-ranking than the usual officials, so they're making relatively more noise about it.
Hmm.
But I don't think it'll really amount to anything. I don't think they're going to start anything just because the what is it, House Majority Leader decides to go to Taiwan. I don't think it's worth it from China's perspective. There is some risk from the American perspective, but it's pretty mild. I think both countries are more interested in dealing with their own problems right now, of which there are quite a few. I don't think either is looking to expand on those problems by starting some kind of conflict over Taiwan.
Yeah, and also just generally, if you're shooting at a known diplomat on a plane, that's like a hyper aggressive move, not just like
Yeah.
it was a military small vessel that happened to be out of bounds and you shot at that. That's pretty different from this is clearly a diplomat kind of person who's just going to shake hands and talk to people, and shooting at them would be a major escalation of aggression, which could escalate to war.
Yeah. That's actually another weird aspect of it, though, because apparently Pelosi did not coordinate with the Biden administration before organizing the trip. So it kind of makes the U.S. government look a little dysfunctional. There were some people in the Biden administration who were saying that it was a bad idea and that she shouldn't go and that she should have consulted with them first. So basically, more of the Biden administration being the Biden administration, basically. But yeah, I don't think anybody in China or the Chinese government is suffering from the delusion that this is some kind of organized effort by the U.S. government to embarrass China by having a high-level official go to Taiwan. I don't. It's not going to be the perspective. It's just going to be a minor one-off trip, probably mostly done to bolster her political credentials so that she can say she's tough on China or something later on. But yeah, I don't think it's that substantive, so I don't really have any expectations as far as any major fallout one way or the other. So yeah, chalk it up to media hype more than anything.
Empty threats being something to talk about.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense from a war strategy perspective to actually shoot at planes in this context, but it is kind of scary to hear if you're not really thinking about the odds of them actually shooting at them. It sounded like that there was a fighter jet escort of the flight, but is that actually the case?
Yeah, I think I read that she's going to travel there on a military aircraft. So she will be flying via government aircraft, official U.S. government aircraft. So that could make Chinese action more or less likely. I mean, less likely in the sense that, actually shooting at a military aircraft is more likely to incur a direct response. But you could also say more likely because that's more symbolic. The symbolism. I mean, it would be one thing if it was just a government official traveling just via commercial airliner, but for her to travel here specifically in military aircraft kind of sends home that the U.S. is kind of almost condoning the trip. I don't think the Biden administration is allowing it to condone it. I think they're just allowing it for safety reasons. So again, not that big a deal. I wouldn't read too much into it. That's not to say it's impossible that something might happen. There is a non-zero probability that the Chinese government feels compelled to send some kind of signal by taking an action that could be escalatory in nature. But it just seems pretty unlikely given the broader chessboard at this point.
Is there a rift between the Biden administration and whatever branch of the Democratic Party that Pelosi represents, or why is this something that they said that they didn't condone?
No, I think it's just Pelosi taking the initiative, basically, for political reasons. She probably just assumed it would be relatively low risk. Probably didn't think she needed to ask permission. Politicians tend to have big egos. That's not too unusual in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
The Biden administration just by saying that they don't condone it per se, they're just signaling to the Chinese that this is not an official government signal per se to the Chinese government. This is just something happening as a function of U.S. politics that doesn't really involve China per se.
Interesting. Overhyped Taiwan expedition.
Yeah. Yeah, I was joking with a friend from China the other day. Are you guys going to shoot down Pelosi's plane? What's the deal with that? Consensus seems to be no. Probably not.
No, we just need a threatened posture to look tough. You know how it is. Everyone wants to look tough.
Well, wow. 'Tis the season. We've got midterm elections coming up here in the U.S. in a couple months. And then China's got its big conference coming up in which Xi Jinping is going to get his third term in office officiated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a big deal for both parties. And so everybody kind of wants to look tough, but they don't actually want to have to do anything that would actually distract from the politics of retaining or obtaining power, depending on which actor we're talking about. Yeah, conflicts are messy. You don't want to be accused of being too soft or accidentally starting a conflict or what have you. Kind of makes you look bad. Makes it easy for people to kind of score points on you. So neither government is interested in that at this point. And both government definitely has been more vulnerable the past year. The Biden administration, obviously, between all of the the Afghan imbroglio, inflation, and this, that, or the other minor issue. They've been in trouble with a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. So they're not looking for another reason to be accused of being bad at their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But then Xi Jinping has also kind of opened himself up for criticism through the whole zero COVID policy. That hasn't done the Chinese economy any favors. And it's kind of looking increasingly untenable over time. And that's in conjunction with the wolf warrior diplomacy that he spearheaded. It was most likely Xi Jinping, or at least his inner circle's idea, to have a more forceful foreign policy. That was something they started doing sort of mid-decade, last decade. And it hasn't really worked great. They don't really have much to show for it, other than sort of a damaged relationship with the West, which they didn't need. They probably would have been just as well off continuing to kind of slowly build up their economy and economic influence. There are reasons for that change. They did kind of see that the international linkages that China was making as a result of its economic development and integration with the global economy was having political repercussions. And so the party wanted to start focusing on those in order to mitigate risks. And so that was part of the impetus towards having a more vocal, forceful foreign policy. But I think they kind of just dialed it up to 11 unnecessarily. They didn't need to go as hard as they did.
Mm-hmm.
They could have just done it quietly, clandestinely, rather than trying to just openly pressure governments to kind of toe their line. So Xi Jinping could be criticized for that as well. And of course, there's all of the economic problems. The whole shadow banking thing is kind of slowly reaching some kind of crescendo. And it may or may not implode the economy. Anybody's guess. Probably not, but it's dicey. And I'm sure there are people who would argue that Xi Jinping and his government could have handled it better, in one way or the other. So Xi Jinping is not any more interested in any kind of conflict over Taiwan right now. It doesn't really help him.
Yeah, it seems like the Chinese method has been more so to have an influence victory rather than a conventional military victory for their respective territories that they want to have in their sphere. I know a lot of people have seen the war in Ukraine and been like, what if China does this in Taiwan? But it doesn't quite seem like their style.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a famous quote from, I think it was Deng Xiaoping, back when he was in power like 30 years ago. And I can't remember it verbatim, but basically the gist of it is that China's foreign policy would be to kind of keep quiet, stay out of the limelight, and slowly build up their power over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really been the principal focus of China's foreign policy for much of the past 30 years, up until Xi Jinping shifted gears around 2015 and started focusing on actually exerting some of Chinese power in order to try to achieve certain foreign policy objectives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, trying to make sure that other countries didn't host dissidents, that other countries didn't criticize China too much, things like that. Nothing too major in the grand scheme of things. They still haven't really tried particularly hard to get, say, foreign military bases. Although they do have a few, and there were rumors that they were trying to get more. But it doesn't seem to be a main driver right now. It seems like mostly they want to try to use their economic influence to achieve objectives. And they've had moderate success in doing that thus far. So yeah, they're not really about using force, at least not right now. It's just much easier and economical to use influence, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see. Maybe Xi Jinping gets more aggressive once he's had his third term confirmed. At that point, the biggest political event on the calendar for China is off the table, and you can focus on other things. And, who's to say? Maybe he gets more ambitious. Maybe he wants to burn some of his political capital to try to do something big. I'm a little skeptical. I don't really see that as all that likely, given that there's not a surfeit of great opportunities for China to pursue in that regard. Everything comes with risks.
Mm-hmm.
And China's political system is generally pretty risk-averse. So I suspect he's going to focus a lot more on things like COVID policy and managing the economy, of which there's quite a bit to manage at this point. That'll probably take up quite a bit of political capital just doing that much.
Do you know much about the Chinese military doctrine? We talked about that a little bit with the Ukraine war, where the Russian military doctrine is basically blasted with artillery a whole bunch of times until it's really busted up and then go in.
Yeah.
Whereas the American military doctrine is fire superiority. You want to make sure you have greater ability to have infantry shooting with guns in an area, and then you slowly advance through there. Do you know what the Chinese military doctrine is?
I haven't read a whole lot regarding that topic, so I can't comment too much. I know they were heavily influenced by the Soviets during the Cold War, but I also know that they've been trying to modernize their doctrine over the past couple decades. They've been trying to copy more American ideas of combined arms warfare, so the focus has been more on that. But they also haven't fought a war in a long time, so they haven't gotten a lot of practice, and the military itself has been pretty politicized. It's mostly controlled by the party, and the party's focus is on making sure that the military is loyal. So that generally doesn't bode well for meritocracy within the officer corps.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not be that they have enough experience or leadership with sufficient expertise in order to really pull off a modern combined arms doctrine like what the US has. That hasn't stopped them from trying, but it may be that if they actually had to test it in combat, that wouldn't really work very well in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So beyond that, I know that they've been focusing on area denial weaponry. They've been trying to develop weapons that will allow them to project force in their near abroad, so that they can make it relatively more difficult for the US Navy in particular, if not just the US military in general, to operate in the South China Sea and the immediate seas around Chinese territory. But yeah, beyond that, I think that's about all I could tell you. I'd have to read a lot more to really get you a more in-depth answer than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're trying to modernize. I've read a couple articles about them trying to modernize their command and control systems. But that's also more of a leadership thing than a technology thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can have the systems in place, but if your officers don't really know how to use them or don't know how to take the initiative, then it's kind of wasted. Yeah, we'll see what happens with it. From what I've read, they're still pretty far behind Western militaries in terms of just the overall quality of leadership and doctrine in the Chinese military.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean they would be as bad as, say, the Russian military has been. The Russian military has, similar problems to corruption and centralized top-down leadership systems as the Chinese military does, but they've got way more corruption and way less money to work with.
Mm-hmm.
All the same problems, but exacerbated, basically. So they would probably do a little better, at least in that regard. But I doubt the Chinese military would really want to learn the hard way. They're probably going to play for more time.
Well. Were there any updates on the war in Ukraine? I saw some kind of bad articles where it's just like tabloids and they're saying that this person said this or that, but nothing really substantive in terms of any major changes.
I don't think there's been any change in the overall trends that are dominating the war right now. The Russians are still focusing on Donbass. There's been some Ukrainian progress in and around Kherson, but it's been pretty incremental.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing like big sweeping operations. So they're picking away at it. And I think they did destroy some bridges across the Dnieper. They destroyed a bridge across the Dnieper, which is one of the main bridges through which Russian forces on the west side of the river are supplied. When the Russians seized the city of Kherson, they had to cross the Dnieper River. So most of the city and the Russian forces fighting in Kherson Oblast were actually west of the river. So blowing up one of the few bridges across the river actually does hobble their logistics a bit.
Mm-hmm.
They also blew up a bridge that was on a tributary of the Dnieper in Kherson Oblast. And because they blew that up, I think that they bifurcated Russian forces west of the river. I don't think there was very many bridges, anyway, connecting sort of the northern and southern forces in Kherson. So when they blew up that bridge, then they basically were separated. I don't think the tributary is nearly as big as the Dnieper, though, so it may not be as big an obstacle if they wanted to put up, like, some pontoons or something. But it'll at least make things a little more difficult. Now, they can't completely cut off Russian forces west of the Dnieper because one of the major crossings is actually on top of a major dam. And obviously blowing up a dam would cause some problems for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It's not really something you want to do. And I think also it generates a lot of electricity. So that's another reason they probably won't blow it up. But yeah, that dam is probably safe. So that means that the Russians will pretty much always have at least one safe route across the Dnieper.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've always struggled to pronounce that, even way back when I was reading about it, when I was in high school, reading about World War II. That river came up a lot on the Eastern Front, but it was never entirely clear how it was supposed to be pronounced. It's spelled like Dnieper, but I think the D is supposed to be silent, or something weird like that. Maybe somebody in chat knows. Maybe now would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I am clearly not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have a stronger background in some topics than others, so if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do point it out. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this because can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. So, but I will see it later when I pick through chat. Well, let's see. Ukraine. Yeah, there's been some moves, but most of them are not military in nature, really. So the SBU is Ukraine's intelligence agency, and the deputy director was actually removed. Also, the prosecutor general of Ukraine was also removed from her job. And then several regional SBU chiefs were removed. So this had to do with some ambiguously defined new information of some kind. They didn't really go into it. But apparently, there's been a lot of investigations by the Ukrainian government into the nature of the collapse in their front line at the south of Ukraine at the start of the war. And apparently, they found a considerable number of people in higher levels of government that were collaborating with the Russian army, which contributed to the collapse of that southern front. So now apparently they've got enough evidence to kind of go after people. I don't think the deputy director of the SBU was necessarily implicated directly in collaboration. I think the issue there is more that he failed to prevent it in the first place. When you're a spy chief and, a big chunk of your spies turn out to be double agents or spies themselves, that's not a great look for you. That's a counterintelligence failure. It's worth mentioning, too, that the SBU director was actually not really a professional, per se. He was actually a childhood friend of the president, that is to say, President Zelensky. So, on the one hand, that's not great. Obviously, you want somebody with experience in spycraft to have that kind of job. But on the other hand, Ukrainian government and institutions of government were notorious for having been infiltrated by a multitude, of Russian intelligence agencies over the past couple decades. So having somebody you trust in government in such circumstances can be more important than having somebody who's relatively more professional.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, since 2014, the Ukrainian government has done a pretty good job, or so I've read, of rooting out a lot of the spies and agents, that is to say, Russian agents that have been in the Ukrainian government. So in general, that's become less of a problem. And that would suggest that professionalism would be a more attractive feature of somebody who's going to head your intelligence agency, among other, agencies of government. So that combined with the intelligence failure in the early part of the war seems to be what led the president to fire this guy, as well as his prosecutor general and some of the regional chiefs.
How do you root out spies like that?
Well, that's difficult. It's inherently difficult. I mean, there's signals intelligence, like maybe you can catch them communicating with their spy masters, in another country or in your own country even. That's actually how the Chinese government was able to roll up a network of CIA spies in China. The software that they were using to contact their CIA spy masters was compromised, and they ended up using that to figure out who the CIA had been contacting. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to infiltrate your enemy's spy agency. So if you can find contacts in their spy agency, or turn one of their high-level guys or something, then they can give you information about that country's spy operations in your country. So you can figure out who's a spy that way. Basically, you just get the enemy spy agency to tell you, in that case, who their spies are. You can set traps too. Like if you suspect somebody might be a spy, or if you find out that some key piece of intelligence that a limited number of people had access to was leaked somehow, you can kind of narrow down who it might be and then set a trap of some kinds, such that you can catch them in the act. So that's another way. I'm not an expert in spycraft, so this is just me spitballing stuff that I've read about, pretty much.
That sounds like something a spy would say. That's
my cover.
A very dangerous line of work for sure, because that's something that governments really don't want floating around in their system. It is I think a general case that basically any major country is going to have some spies on the countries that they want to keep tabs on. So it's a fairly common thing. But yeah, definitely a very high skill kind of thing. And then there's also the difficulty of a spy infiltrating to the point where they can get the juicy information that's hard to obtain. That's tough to do. And it takes a really long-term investment as well, because you have to build trust. Because I'm kind of thinking about the two sides of it, where you want a mixture of loyalty and skill that's going to give you the best possible fit of someone in your military, because if you compromise skill for too much loyalty, then you get incompetent military. And then if you go for all raw skill and you're not really checking for loyalty, then you can get some bad actors who don't actually care about the chain of command, and they just kind of want to do their own shit, or they're working for someone else.
Yeah, exactly. That's the trade-off. You can try to mitigate that by ensuring that you have a culture of professionalism in your spy agency so that people are well trained and well vetted.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of minimizes the likelihood that they kind of turn traitor on you or some such. But if you don't have that much money or experience, that can be difficult. So in that case, you kind of have to default more to trust over expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Did we talk about that Canadian turbine?
I don't think so.
Well, a
What
couple
happened with
weeks
that?
ago. Huh?
What happened with that?
Well, the Russian government curtailed gas exports
Mm-hmm.
to Europe a couple weeks ago, and the nominal excuse that they gave was that there was a key part, specifically a turbine made by a Canadian company that was being, I think it was being refitted or maintained or something. And supposedly the sanctions regime that had been levied against Russia prevented the Canadian firm from allowing, well, from exporting that turbine back into Russia so that they could reinstall it.
Mm-hmm.
So the Canadian government apparently gave that company a waiver, and that turbine ended up getting shipped after all, and the Russian government was able to install it. And then later on, they announced that they were going to resume gas exports. So that drama kind of ended in an anticlimactic way.
Mm-hmm.
And it also seems to have been bullshit, because a couple of days ago, the Russian government announced that they're going to cut gas again. So it would be weird if they needed to do more maintenance. You know, they had said that part of the reason for the previous cutoff had been maintenance issues related to the turbine, but now they don't have that excuse. So it kind of seems like they're just doing it arbitrarily at this point. Most likely, their strategy is to try to mitigate, or at least significantly impede, the ability of European states to stock up on gas for winter. And what the Russians want to do, I suspect, is they want to make sure that they don't have enough stores so that they can cut them off or threaten to cut them off from gas in the dead of winter when demand for gas is at its highest in Europe. And so that their leverage is maximized. A lot of European governments would feel a lot of pressure if their people were freezing, especially over Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So the Russian government seems to be trying to engineer that outcome so that they'll be able to do that later. Europe has been trying to respond, but it's just inherently difficult because they were so dependent on gas, previously. So they've been having to do a pretty dramatic 180. Some countries have been more successful than others. Overall, they've been doing pretty good.
Doing a 180 in terms of looking for other sources of gas or like clean energy alternatives, or both, I guess.
Pretty much both. One of the ways you can cut your gas consumption is by using more renewable energy. So in so much as there was excess capacity before, they're tapping that, or trying to tap it now, so that they can cut gas consumption in things like electricity generation. I think in Germany it breaks down like this: about a third of gas consumption is used for electricity production. A third is roughly used in a given year to heat homes, and then a third is used by industry for production. So if you can produce electricity using other stuff, that can pretty significantly cut gas consumption right there. Heating homes is a little difficult. There's not a lot of substitutes for that. But in the case of industry, sometimes there's alternatives. There was at least a couple of plants that had coal plants. Some factories have their own power generating plants. Small ones, but that's how they kind of generate the electricity that they need. And there was at least a few factories that still had coal electricity plants on site, and they'd been set to be retired, but obviously circumstances changed, and so a number of them are reversing course and are trying to get them online. That's kind of a mixed blessing, since a lot of the coal that Germany had been importing was actually imported from Russia. So that may not necessarily work in the grand scheme of things, but coal is a lot easier to find substitutes for than, say, natural gas, just because that's a tangible physical commodity that you can load up and export much more easily than, say, natural gas. With natural gas, you either export it through a very large and expensive pipeline that you build over time, or alternatively, you have to freeze it. I think it's to something like negative 200 plus degrees Fahrenheit, and then you have to store it in these special containers that can keep it at that temperature. And then you ship it overseas, and then you unload it into what's called a regasification facility. And the facility takes that cold liquid gas, and then it reconverts it back into natural gas that's actually usable by industry, homes, what have you. So it can be done, but it's a complicated, expensive process.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, natural gas is just hard to export in general, whereas with coal, you just mine it and stick it on a barge or something, and then you're set.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah, Europe is trying to shift away from natural gas consumption in whatever ways they can manage, but they're not going to be able to fully shift away, so they're also focusing on finding alternative sources of gas. Yeah, in general, they're doing pretty good. I think the principal problem is Central Europe. Central Europe seems to be much more dependent on Russian gas than other parts of Europe, and, maybe even that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but they have a harder time finding alternatives because they're not necessarily as well connected to the natural gas infrastructure in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So those are going to be the problem children overall. I think mostly it's the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. I think those are the biggest challenges right now. Hungary is not even really a challenge because they don't give a shit. The Orban government is very pro-Russia. They've even, gone to Russia over the past month or so and literally asked them for more natural gas. And it was because of Hungarian opposition to sanctions and other coordination in response to the whole Ukraine crisis that Hungary was given an exemption to the plan to cut gas consumption in Europe over the course of the next couple of years, I think it was. So Hungary is very dependent on Russian natural gas, but it doesn't really matter because they're pro-Russian and they're going to keep getting gas anyway. So, moot point. The European Union doesn't really have to worry about them. But the Czechs and the Slovaks, they do have to worry about, and I'm not entirely sure how they're going to manage that. I've been trying to read more about it. I tried to read more about it the past couple days to try to get caught up on Europe's strategic situation, strategic circumstances, that is, as far as natural gas. And that's still a question mark for me. But everywhere else seems to have managed to find alternatives thus far, such that even if Russia completely cut off gas, it would be manageable. It would be impactful.
Yeah, prices would go up for people.
Yeah, it would be a problem, but it would be doable. They would make it. There would not be such a huge shortfall that people would have to freeze or industry would have to completely shut down writ large. Yeah, for France and Spain, they actually have a lot of LNG terminals already. I think Spain in particular surprised me. They've got something like half a dozen to a dozen LNG terminals, which is quite a few. That's quite a few. So they're going to be fine. The whole western sort of Iberian Peninsula there also is going to be fine, just because they import so much gas from Algeria. So Algeria can basically just increase production and make up for any shortfalls. So the North African source of natural gas there can compensate for any Russian shortfalls. And I think North African natural gas will also provide for Italy, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't read as much about Italy's situation. They had been pretty heavily dependent on Russian gas, but they do have pipelines that run to North Africa that could pipe in natural gas to replace Russian natural gas. So that could be sufficient to replace it. So I think Italy would be fine as well. The Netherlands is interesting because they actually used to produce a pretty decent amount of natural gas. They've been importing, since then, they've been importing more Russian natural gas because there's been some environmental controversies, basically, over the production of natural gas in country. There's apparently some earthquakes or something that people didn't particularly appreciate, so the government started cracking down. But it looks like they're going to reverse course. I even read an article that a lot of the environmentalists that had been opposing natural gas production had changed their mind just because of the Ukraine context. They appreciated that it would be necessary to reduce dependency on Russian natural gas. So the Netherlands is actually going to increase production of its own natural gas. And that should be enough to kind of get them through. in conjunction with imports from other places. I think they also have an LNG terminal that they could use. And from what I was reading about Belgium, they were going to just import natural gas from the Netherlands and take advantage of their increased production. So the Benelux countries should be okay. You know, the low countries will have their own sources to deal with. And I think Scandinavia mostly gets theirs from Norway, as I understand it. Norway is a major producer of natural gas, and they've got a number of pipelines up there in that region, including to the UK. So the UK, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they should all be fine. You know, they've got alternatives ready to go in the form of Norway. The Baltics are a little more tricky. They've been heavily dependent on Russian gas up till now, but they've been pretty dramatically shifting course. I mean, the governments in the Baltics have a lot of political capital to work with in terms of finding other sources. So even if it's more expensive or it takes time, most of the population there seems to be on board with it. Yeah, from what I was reading, there's one LNG terminal in Lithuania that actually, I think, just started production, actually just started operations earlier this year, so very well timed. And apparently they're going to start sourcing a lot of their natural gas through that terminal. And they've also rented a regasification ship. I mentioned before regasification, right? That's the process by which the liquid natural gas is converted back into regular natural gas, you know, gaseous natural gas, whatever the proper term for that is. So you don't, you know, normally you produce like a whole facility to do that, but there are actually ships that have that technology built into them, and you can actually rent them, and they'll just come to your country and dock, you know, in a port, and you can hook them up to your infrastructure and just directly convert the gas right there, you know, on the ship. So from what I was reading, I think all three countries are going to sort of jointly rent one or more of those regasification ships to increase their capacity to process LNG. Because I did also read that the one facility in Lithuania would not be sufficient to provide for all of the natural gas needs for all of the Baltic states. So they are going to have to try to find further arrangements, but it seems like regasification ships are going to be the way they do that. They've also got a huge storage site in Latvia that they've apparently been leaning on in order to try to help. So that'll help buy them some time anyway. Finland is also interesting. Finland apparently isn't all that connected to Norway, which I kind of assumed they were. So instead, they're connected to the Baltic states. There's actually a pipeline that crosses from Estonia across the channel that separates Estonia from Finland and then goes into Finland. So Finland is sort of in the same boat as the Baltic states. They're all going to share natural gas, apparently. And the Finnish government has said that they're going to cooperate with Estonia, if not also the other Baltic states, as far as paying for and planning. Well, as far as planning and organizing alternative natural gas arrangements for the region. So they're at relatively more risk, but they're also making good headway in terms of finding those alternatives. So they should be okay in the medium run, at least. And then Poland just already went full ham. Russia cut them off of gas, off from gas very early on. That had to do with a dispute over payment in rubles. You know, basically the Russian government demanded that Europe pay for the natural gas it was importing with rubles instead of with euros. And basically, for most of Europe, a compromise was reached in which a Russian bank account in Switzerland was used to conduct the transaction so that technically no sanctions were being breached. I don't know that the Russians were entirely pleased with that because it's not really quite the open market operations they wanted. You know, what they wanted is for European states to buy rubles on the open market in order to float the value of the ruble. But just kind of converting within a single bank kind of gets around that. So it was a decent enough compromise. Nobody was particularly happy, but it worked. But some states, partly on principle and partly for legal reasons, did not want to do even that much. And Poland was one of them. And the result is that Russia just cut them off from all gas exports. Now, that's okay for Poland because they themselves built a LNG terminal in the on the northern coast of their country that came into operation not too long ago, I think a couple years ago. And so they've been mostly importing gas through that. I think they also have some connections to the rest of the European network. So they've probably been able to also import some from them. They've been doing pretty good. I mean, from what I was reading, they've actually almost filled up their storage capacity for natural gas. Although that was apparently the source of some controversy. You know, one of the things the European Union has been doing has been trying to come to agreements regarding solidarity. So one of the things the European Union wants to do is to require that European states that have surpluses of natural gas in storage to share them with states that have shortages of natural gas. And Poland has again, a huge amount stored at this point. Something like 80 to 90% of their storage capacity has been filled. But apparently the Polish government isn't all that interested in sharing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been the source of some consternation in the European Union. On the one hand, Poland has definitely been one of the leading states in terms of supporting Ukraine and in terms of confronting Russia, but at the same time, they've kind of been a bit of a spoiler in terms of some of the solidarity measures. So that's Poland for you. It's kind of the role they've been filling the past 10-some years, so maybe it shouldn't be a surprise.
Does the country that does the storage and then ends up sharing with people who have a shortage get any benefit?
I mean, I have to assume they get paid for it. I don't think they have to share it for free, per se, but the government does have to at least make it available.
I see.
I think that's the issue.
Mm.
Yeah, somebody in chat can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I haven't read all of the details as far as that dispute, but that's my understanding of it. But Poland will be fine. They've got the natural gas they need. They've got plenty stored, obviously, but then they've also got the LNG terminal if they need more. Actually, one of the fun examples here is Greece and Bulgaria, if not also Romania. I knew that those countries had been pretty heavily dependent on Russian natural gas before, so I'd been assuming that they were particularly vulnerable to a gas cutoff and that they must be therefore be pretty reluctant to support Ukraine and to otherwise support the European Union's efforts to become independent of Russian natural gas. But I was actually wrong, because it turns out that Greece started construction of an LNG terminal a couple of years ago so that they could have a more independent energy policy, and it actually just started operating like recently. Like, the timing is impeccable, basically perfect. So they have this LNG terminal online now, and because of that, they're going to go from being heavily dependent on Russian gas to basically not needing any in a very short period of time. So Russia had leverage over that region up until like a month or two ago, and so that's no longer an issue for the European Union. So both Greece and Bulgaria has pipeline links to Greece, so LNG pumped through that terminal in Greece can be extended into Bulgaria to help them. So Bulgaria and Greece are going to be fine as far as natural gas. Romania is an interesting example too, although in their case it has more to do with home-produced natural gas. I hadn't really thought of Romania as being a big natural gas producer, but apparently they do produce most of what they need, from what I was reading. So if they got cut off, it would be a big inconvenience. But it would not be such a huge blow that it would cripple them economically. So they're not actually as vulnerable as I thought for that reason.
For natural gas, is it like other forms of oil like gasoline and other fuel where you have to do a refining step?
Yeah. Yeah, you do have to refine it.
Because I've heard for some parts of the world that's one of the limiting factors, where they have a bunch of the raw stuff, but they don't have the refining capacity to just use it themselves.
Yeah, exactly. It's difficult to transport, though. Like with oil, let's use Venezuela as an example. So Venezuela used to be, anyway, a major oil producer, but they didn't actually have hardly any refinery capacity. So what would happen is that Venezuela would export the oil generally to the United States or possibly to the Dutch Antilles. Extra points if you know what the Dutch Antilles is. some Caribbean islands there just north of Venezuela. And the Venezuelans would export their oil there, and it would be refined there into, various petroleum products, like gasoline for cars, for example. So then, let's stick with gasoline. Then the gasoline would be shipped back to Venezuela for consumption. And that would be how Venezuela got gasoline and other petroleum products. Like, they didn't refine them or process them in Venezuela hardly at all. But that was a relatively simple process because oil is easy to transport, relatively speaking. You can just squirt it into a big oil tanker and then ship it wherever it needs to go. Bulk terminals for oil shipments like that, they're expensive, but not too complicated per se. LNG terminals, by contrast, are much more complicated because you have to get the temperature just right. You have to keep it at that temperature over time. And if you don't, you can just basically ruin the whole batch. It'll be a problem. And the whole thing is pretty volatile regardless. So it's a sensitive process, and it requires a lot of technical expertise and also a lot of money. So that makes it much more difficult for, say, a major natural gas producer to then just basically outsource refining that they need done to another country. The process of exporting LNG to another country, having it refined into a final product, and then exporting that final product back, that's not very cost efficient. It makes a lot more sense just to develop your own refining capacity, however costly that may be. But yeah, overall, Europe is relatively secure in terms of natural gas. Germany kind of has a problem. They have a lot of industry that might have to significantly curtail operations. But there's a decent chance they'll be able to manage that pretty well. For one, it might be a warm winter. They had a relatively warm winter last year. So that could cut natural gas consumption right there. And they do have alternatives as far as electricity production that could cut natural gas consumption. They've got some nuclear power plants they were planning on retiring this year. As far as I know, they're still planning on doing that, but it would make a lot of sense to not do that for obvious reasons. You could very easily, I imagine, cancel that process and bring them back online. It might take some time to bring them back online, but I imagine it could be done, and that could significantly help their cause. So that could be something they do later. And they're also trying to bring back some coal-powered power plants in order to try to generate some electricity there. For industry, worst comes to worst, they're going to do rationing. And, people will come first. Home consumers will get first priority as far as natural gas. But after that, they're trying to pick out which industries are relatively more important. So they can prioritize them over the less important ones. From what I was reading, the chemicals industry and the glass-making industry in particular are going to get deprioritized and will probably be hit the hardest. So the knock-on effect there that will be relevant for the rest of the world will probably be fertilizer production, since the chemicals industry in Germany produces a pretty good amount of fertilizer. So fertilizers are already more expensive around the world because Russia itself is a major producer of fertilizers, and disruptions to their supply chain and sanctions have driven up costs. But if German fertilizer production is also hit, that's just going to drive up costs even more. So obviously that's going to be a problem for agricultural production, which is already getting squeezed by the aforementioned Russian fertilizer problems and also by various droughts and other weather-related phenomena. So it would be a very inopportune time to have a German fertilizer squeeze. But that may well be what happens if there's a gas cutoff. Glassmaking, I think, doesn't sound that important, but it would impact more the automotive industry because they need the glass for like windshields and stuff. Maybe they could find a substitute, or maybe they could shake up the composition of their windshield such that they need relatively less gas, or maybe there's another process that you can use to make gas that doesn't involve so much natural gas. But regardless, they're going to have to figure out some kind of way around that. So the automotive industry could take a hit for that reason.
Glass is something that I feel like could make a bit of a comeback if people get more out of the habit of using plastics for everything. It's more reusable, and I think it's comparatively less bad for the environment. It's not going to be getting into the digestive systems of sea creatures and stuff, which we then later eat in the same way.
Mm.
Bring
It
back
could be.
glass. Let's go.
Yeah. It depends on the type of sand they need, though. Glass is made using sand. And sand, you would assume, would be bountiful, but there's actually different types of sand and different processes requires specific of those types. And
Mm.
sometimes that can create a problem. So I already know that construction, for example, requires very fine sand as part of the process of laying the foundation, and probably other, aspects of the operation I'm not familiar with. But basically, construction requires very fine sand. And because there's just been so much construction over the past couple decades because of the global economic boom, there's actually something of a shortage of sand at this point because all of the obvious sources of fine-grained sand are increasingly being used up to the point where in India, there's actually organized criminal groups that specialize in smuggling sand from locations where extracting it is illegal. So there was one story about a farmer who had a farm next to a river, and he just woke up one day and realized that overnight some gang had come and actually taken all of the sand that was along the river. It's bizarre, right? But
Yeah,
that's happening.
that's
That's
some
a
like
real thing.
geographical robbery shit. We are stealing the land underneath you. It
Yeah, so
reminds me of
Lupin,
those houses where it's like aliens abduct a bunch of stuff and they're just in their bed and there's like a huge chasm around them just because a bunch of stuff was munched away. This guy's
yeah.
got his farm on the river and then he wakes up and like half of his land is just gone and it's a huge abyss.
Yeah, he was certainly surprised.
How are they quiet about that? Wouldn't you need like heavy equipment that would be like beeping and noisy? They
Well,
probably
I mean,
hack it and turn off the beeps.
if you hear vehicles and stuff outside your house, sand smugglers is probably not the assumption you make.
Boy, it's gonna be for me now. I'm gonna wake up in the middle of the night to some, I don't know, a garbage truck that's beeping outside and be like, "Don't take my sand."
I'm sorry I've made you paranoid.
I'll get over it. There isn't even sand here anyway. We have rocky beaches.
There you go. You're safe.
Joke's on them.
But yeah, I mean, if glass production in, you know, the automotive sector, say, or what have you, requires fine-grained sand like that, it may not actually be that good of a substitute. Because if there was a massive shift from, say, plastic bags to, well, not glass bag, bottles, basically, a shift from plastic bottles to glass bottles, that could just exacerbate the shortage in fine-grained sand, just push up costs to the point where it wouldn't be economically viable to make that transition.
Mm.
So in that case, maybe something like paper would be a better way to go. I know it sounds strange to have, well, there's paper cups. That's a thing. Maybe not paper bottles yet, but that technically would be feasible.
You've got like cartons of milk and stuff that are not made out of plastic.
Yeah, and up in Canada, they actually have bags of milk.
So weird.
So it's doable, right?
Yeah.
Not sure how we got onto that. I think we were talking about natural gas.
Yep. We were talking about kind of different forms of energy, and then we got into glass.
Oh, I see.
Glass
Oh, right.
production,
Germany
sand
cutting.
sortage, and then the sand
Gotcha.
thieves.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, Germany will ration their natural gas. So they should be okay. They're working on natural gas terminals as well, but they'd kind of been delaying construction for a while, so they're actually behind the curve on that. You might wonder why Germany doesn't just use the natural gas terminals in Spain, since they've already got a whole shit ton, apparently. And the problem there has to do with connectivity. Spain's natural gas infrastructure is not well linked to the rest of Europe. So that means that it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to unload liquid natural gas in these terminals in Spain and then convert them to gas and then ship the gas through via pipeline to the rest of Europe. You know, the necessary infrastructure doesn't really exist. I was reading that there had been some attempts to build that infrastructure so that it would be in place, but apparently there were some problems at the government level, such that there was, I didn't get the gist of exactly what the issue was. Maybe the routing or who was going to pay for it or whatever, but whatever the problem was, the government's basically canceled the project. And so it didn't end up happening. So that means Germany is kind of on its own a little bit there. But they're working on it. They've got a combination of different, basically a whole bunch of little things they're going to do. You know, rationing, encouraging people to cut consumption, finding alternative sources of electricity, what have you. The Baltics kind of are doing that. The Baltics and Scandinavia have actually been pretty good over the past 10, 20 years of finding alternative ways to generate energy. Well, to get energy, basically. One of them is like biofuels. So there's not a whole lot of electricity and stuff generated via biofuels in the region, you know, the Baltics and Scandinavia. But that, in conjunction with other sort of little experiments here and there, is enough to generate a pretty good chunk, to the point where they're not nearly as dependent on energy imports as they used to be.
What are biofuels? What are biofuels?
Like, oh, well, that's like just burning.
Poop?
I mean, there's different examples. It's like a broad category. Like one example is just burning wood, for example.
Oh, okay.
And generating electricity that way in a very efficient way. You know, they've got some kind of technology they use to make it like much more efficient. But you can also use it to burn something like peat. I think that's the other main example. So basically like swamp land, swamp soil, you know, whatever that is. You know, they can take that and then they can burn it and generate electricity. A lot of peat is imported from Belarus, so that's probably not workable, but you can import it from other places too. I think there was like a huge reserve of peatland that was discovered in DR Congo recently, so that could be a decent alternative source. But it's in the DR Congo, so it might be a little difficult getting it out of the country. But yeah, that's a little review of the natural gas situation in Europe. It's not as dire as some people make it out to be. There's going to be some problems for the Czechs, the Slovaks, but other than them, everybody else should be okay in a worst-case scenario. So overall, the European economy will probably muddle through the next year or so, regardless of circumstances. So let's see, we were talking about, oh yeah, Ukraine. So I was talking about the turbine. So that's all relevant to Ukraine because, of course, the whole reason there's a natural gas issue is because of the war in Ukraine. Let's see. There were some dissident Chechens who were saying that they were going to plan an offensive in Chechnya. Chechnya, of course, being a restive province of Russia, tried to break away and become independent in the 90s, and there's been butthurt rebels out of there ever since. They usually fight in some of the other conflicts Russia gets in. They're always up for an opportunity to kind of poke them in the eye when the opportunity arises. So some of them have said they're going to try to do some stuff in Chechnya. I don't know how feasible that's going to be, but it was interesting that they were talking about it. I found it interesting because it kind of opens the door to escalation as far as the confrontation between the West and Russia. Since Russia has said that they would not use nukes unless there was a direct threat to Russia itself and its territorial integrity. But if there's a rebellion in Chechnya again, there's going to be the question of whether the West supports it. Because, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So if there's Chechen rebels fighting the Russian government, and you're trying to help the Ukrainian government fight the Russian government, why not help the Chechen rebels? But the Russian government could interpret that as an attempt to, well, at least damage the territorial integrity of Russia. Chechnya is not all that integral to Russia, but technically it is a part. So if the West were interpreted to be trying to break off a chunk of Russia, then maybe that would give the Russian government an excuse to escalate, which could be a problem if we are trying to avoid escalation anyway. I don't know that the Russian government has really needed excuses to escalate thus far. They seem pretty happy to do that just on their own.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it would really matter that much. But technically, there is risk of escalation therein if the West were to support a Chechen rebellion in that way. So that would be something to keep an eye on. Some interesting, difficult strategic questions there for the West.
Yes, Chad, butthurt rebel is a technical term. I think specifically you're referring to the ills that have been done to that people and them having angst and anger against Russia for what happened in the past.
Yeah, there's still a lot of Chechens upset about the Chechen wars in the 90s. There's more than a few Russian atrocities committed over the course of the war. To be fair, they gave as good as they got. There's quite a few Chechen atrocities as well. But that doesn't make it any more palatable for the people who suffered. It's worth pointing out that a lot of Chechens kind of have made peace with that. The main way that the Russian government was able to bring the war to a close was not so much by defeating the rebels as co-opting them. They basically found one of the major Chechen generals in the resistance, and they basically just paid him to become dictator of Chechnya and to run it on his behalf. So the quid pro quo was that Chechnya would remain part of Russia, but in exchange it would have a kind of quasi de facto independence under this guy, under this warlord that they picked out for the job. And so this warlord helped the Russian military against the people who he had been fighting with. And he was able to destroy what remained of the Chechen resistance over the course of subsequent few years. Yeah, that was Kadyrov, if I'm not mistaken. Not the current Kadyrov. The current Kadyrov is actually the son of the warlord that the Russians made the original deal with. Yeah, his father is dead. He actually was assassinated. He was actually assassinated in a pretty metal way. There was he was blown up by a bomb in a stadium, which doesn't sound that exciting. That's a pretty standard way to assassinate somebody, but consider the bomb was actually placed in the stadium during construction. So there was like one major VIP box, basically, that was a part of the construction, and everybody kind of knew that if Kadyrov would visit the stadium, that's where he would be, right? So they put the bomb there. And later on, when he actually did visit, they detonated it, and that's actually what killed him. So pretty
it was
impressive.
Very premeditated.
Yeah, some pretty solid foresight there on the part of the rebels. So there's always been, rebel activity in Chechnya never fully went away, but it's way, way lower than it used to be. Some people go to the forest, as the saying goes, but it's way fewer than was the case even 10 years ago. But there's enough rebels, there's enough Chechens who are upset at the Russian government, and also upset at Kadyrov, for that matter, because his control of Chechnya has been pretty brutal in its own right. There's enough people upset about that stuff to round out a pretty decent Chechen Foreign Legion that has fought in any number of conflicts over the past 20 years, up to and including the Ukraine conflict against Russia. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that there would still be some in Chechnya that would be willing to take up arms again. Now, let's see. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was talking recently about shifting focus. Oh, yeah, that's what it was. So he was saying that because HIMARS have such a long range, that their introduction into the conflict has changed the geography of the conflict. And he said that because of that, Russian ambitions have increased, that they would have to take more land than they'd originally been planning to in order to create a larger buffer zone between Russia itself and Ukrainian-held territory. So nominally, the idea is that because HIMARS have such a long range, they want to push the Ukrainians back in order to mitigate the damage that they can do to Russia itself. Mind you, the Ukrainians have not actually been attacking actual Russian territory with their HIMARS. The United States government has pretty much made them promise that they won't do that. They've also limited the range of the munitions that they offer them. They've limited the selection of munitions available to the Ukrainians to munitions that have a relatively short range. Let's put it like that. in order to mitigate the risk that they'll get ambitious and try to blow up something really important in Russia itself. So I didn't read too much into that comment by Sergei Lavrov, but it does suggest that maybe the Russian government is trying to rationalize before the fact an attempt to take and keep territory in Ukraine, as opposed to just temporarily taking some and then retreating later as a part of some kind of peace deal.
Mm-hmm.
So that may or may not be a substantive comment.
Isn't he a kind of guy who like always shoots from the hip and he says like wild and crazy shit too? I'm mixing him up with someone else.
You know, he didn't used to be. He has been for the past year or so, if not further back. But before, he'd been relatively more statesman-like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's been around a long time. I remember reading about him when I was in high school, reading the news. But in the past year or so, he's had to kind of, you know, the whole Russian government basically has to pretend that Russia is an aggrieved party here and that it's fighting for its rights and its own interests. Mm-hmm. And so just like the rest of the Russian government, he's been pumping out and parroting a lot of Russian propaganda points. And as a result, he's been sounding crazier than usual.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, lately he's been the kind of diplomat that shoots from the hip, so to speak. But that has more to do with the general shift in Russian foreign policy and the tone thereof over the past year or so, rather than his own style, mm-hmm. which again has historically been relatively more measured. It's not to say he's been above casting insults. He's done that quite a bit over the past couple decades. But generally they've been a part of some policy standoff, some issue, you know, some consternation in relations between Russia and the West. He didn't do it just for the sake of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but now
this was
hyper aggro.
Yeah. So did you hear about the torture video recently?
No.
Well, that was a thing. That was
Who tortured
what was it? It was
what and why? Who and why?
Well, it was one of Kadyrov's guys. You know, Kadyrov has a unit of some size of Chechens that have been running around Ukraine, and they claim to be fighting the Ukrainians, but there's actually some evidence that they're actually not doing anything. But they're basically just there doing TikTok videos and other shit like that. But occasionally they will like get their hands on a Ukrainian POW or whatnot, and they'll film themselves interrogating him or humiliating him or something. Mm-hmm. So what happened recently is that one of these Chechen dudes recorded himself castrating a Ukrainian POW, whereupon he placed the separated organs into the prisoner's mouth and then executed him. All of which is apparently on video, so I've read.
What the fuck?
Well, if you've read about the Chechen wars in the 90s, that was a pretty old move. That wasn't unusual on either side, especially in the later stages of the war. But yeah, this is the first time I've read about it happening here, in the present conflict. But yeah, a lot of people were pretty upset about that, for obvious reasons. So that's kind of been making the rounds around the internet lately, and kind of illustrates the barbarity of the conflict. Mm-hmm. Especially on the Russian side. So there was that, and also another item relating to Ukrainian POWs. There was a prison in, I think it was the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, which is, you know, one of the pro-Russian satellite states Russia created in the Donbass after 2014. So there was a prison there that was holding Ukrainian prisoners of war, and it blew up. And nobody seems to know who did it. So the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians did it so that they could blame the Russians for killing Ukrainian POWs. And then, of course, the Ukrainians say that Russians did it in order to hide abuses of said prisoners. No surprise that they would be abusing prisoners. I think everybody pretty much just expects that at this point. So that's a valid point. But regardless, it's kind of hard to prove one way or the other. And it seems like either story would be weird. I mean, for one, why would Russia care if people know that they abuse prisoners? They certainly don't seem to give a shit. Castration videos being the case in point. So I'm not sure why would they would feel particularly compelled to try to cover up evidence or what have you. But at the same time, I don't know why Ukraine would want to try to do some kind of weird false flag like that. Like, why blow up your own guys? It's not as though the Russians aren't doing enough to make themselves look bad already. So it doesn't really make sense either way. Maybe that's evidence itself that the Russians did it, since the Russians have been doing very little that makes sense over the past year or so. So in that sense, it would at least be consistent for them. But otherwise, unless that's the reason, I don't really know what the logic behind it was. I did read one account who said that there didn't seem to have been an actual explosion, that it seemed more like there had been a fire. So it's possible there may have just been some kind of accident or arson or something. Or maybe the local DPR guys just didn't want to have to feed or, pay for their care anymore. So burning them was one way to deal with that. Hard to say. Again, mostly just illustrates the brutality of the conflict. If not also the ambiguity and confusion, the so-called fog of war, if you will. So long story short, don't be a POW.
Yeah, not the most secure and safe line of work for sure.
Yeah. But that's all I had as far as Ukraine updates. Other than that, it's pretty much status quo. Let's see. 7:31. It's already the end of July. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Or were there any other regions or items you wanted to get to here?
Mentioned Taiwan, which was taking up a lot of the news cycle for a bit. There was more stuff about January 6th that I saw floating around in the headlines and so on. Not sure how much is like substantive and like putting people in jail or whatever.
Not really. So what happened is that the Department of Justice announced that they were going to launch they were going to think about launching a criminal investigation. I think that's what it was. They were accumulating evidence so that they could build a case. But I don't think they've technically actually launched a full-on case against Donald Trump yet. I'm not a lawyer, as I've said many times on here, and as I have implicitly made evident many times on here. But yeah, that's my understanding of it. So I don't think the Department of Justice has actually decided to prosecute him yet. And I don't know that they even will in the longer run. In any case, they may just run out of time. It takes a lot of time to build up a case like that. So we could have President Trump back in office before they can even really make a decision on that. And at that point, of course, it's going to be a moot point. So I wouldn't get too excited about it, one way or the other. It's probably not going to go anywhere. Maybe they'll investigate some other people who were peripherally involved. That's a more likely course. It's also, of course, more likely to actually result in convictions. Part of the problem is that there's never been a prosecution of a former sitting president. And some of the law around that is a little weird. It leaves lots of rooms for a defense to argue special privileges. Executive privilege has come up a lot in some of the efforts and investigations they've made thus far. And I don't doubt if they actually went after Trump himself, that would be one of the top arguments they would make. So it's not even entirely clear that even if they wanted to prosecute Trump, that they even would have the legal basis to do so.
Yeah, they talked some about the text messages of Secret Service, of them knowing about avoiding like proper policing of the riot and that sort of thing, more or less wanting it to happen. But yeah, it's tough to exactly pin that down, because for the law to work, it has to be articulated as a particular breach of the law that would need to be punished in some way. So if it's sufficiently fanned out and the situation kind of happened indirectly, then he could get away with it. But if there's like really direct evidence, then he could potentially get in trouble. I think the bigger issue is the push and pull of influence and how this affects his image, because it seemed like his image has gotten worse, over the past few years, maybe as a result of this and some other things, and just generally losing to Biden and then claiming that it was a stolen election and all of that. There are some people who didn't buy into that, so he may have lost a percentage share of the hold on the Republican Party. And then the other big factor is, I think, Murdoch's vote and his decision about who the front-running Republican should be for the next election cycle. That's a really interesting one that I don't know was the case before we had cable TV and so many different political channels, but it almost seems like whichever candidates win the news networks have a massive advantage over the other ones, because they're usually going to be speaking more favorably about some than others, and that's oftentimes not just a political pundit's opinion. It's kind of like a shared message that they say, okay, we're talking well about this person now, we're giving this person airtime, because they can't cover every candidate equal amounts. They're going to gravitate towards some that they think have a good chance of winning. So I think DeSantis is the other potential challenger to Trump for the Republican primary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to imagine that if Trump officially announces he's going to run, then DeSantis would probably drop out. But he's kind of given mixed signals. He's kind of almost hinted that he might stay in anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll see. I doubt he would be able to win if he did, if he tried to beat Trump. It seems unlikely. But we'll see. Yeah, American politics is going to be very colorful if Trump starts to run again.
Mm-hmm.
My apologies to Angelic Nutcake. I remember she mentioned, what was it, late 2020. She was saying she was tired of hearing about American drama in the news.
Yeah.
So I hope she's enjoyed her break. We're probably going to be coming back before too long.
Yeah, that's one of the differences in his strategy versus a lot of other more business professional candidates is he sort of talks in such a way that he can make the news as much as possible. And like Boris the Brexited, you can just like flood the news with something else as soon as something bad happens, and then you've distracted them to focus on something else. That does lead into the UK, which they have their Tory election, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Is it any Tory party member can vote on this? So, like, if you are someone who is a Tory party member, you vote in the elections, but you're not, like, a representative, can you vote in this one? Sort of like a registered Republican or a registered Democrat?
You know, I was actually reading an article about that recently, and apparently the party is pretty cagey about just who can vote in elections like that. So I think that most rank and file voters can participate, but I might be wrong. And they may not even be willing to confirm or deny it one way or the other. Yeah, that competition has been in the news recently. Have you heard about that?
The competition for the next Tory candidate?
Yeah.
I saw some stuff. It's all conservatives, because that's their conservative party, basically.
Yeah.
There was one guy who was saying stuff about gender and that kind of a thing. Basically taking more of a traditional stance on stuff than more of a modern one. But no, I don't know exactly who the candidates are or what people's chances are to win.
Well, they've got it down to 2 now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of them is Liz Truss. And Liz Truss is interesting because she used to be a Remainder, which means that she opposed Brexit back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
But since then, she's done a full 180, and now she's very pro-Brexit, and she tries to run on that. And she's kind of a conservative darling because she's focused more on core conservative issues like tax cuts, for example, and making Brexit work, and etc. So she's kind of favored more by the ideologues in the party, from what I was reading. So her principal opponent right now, well, her only opponent right now is Rishi Sunak. And if he wins, he would be the first prime minister of South Asian descent in the UK's history, which would be pretty fun given the UK's history with India.
He's the one who said the gender stuff. I recognize the
Okay.
description.
Well, his thing in the debates thus far has been more about fiscal responsibility. You know, he's not so much about, you know, rah, get the tax cuts, cut spending, you know, pro-Brexit. He's more about trying to balance the books and stabilizing the British government. You know, he still wants to make Brexit work, but he's more interested in having the government be self-sustaining. So he's not as sexy a candidate as Liz Truss is, politically speaking, but he does carry relatively more gravitas, and that could be what the UK needs right now. But it's not clear which impulse, you know, id or ego, is going to win the day here as far as this competition.
So she would be id and he would be ego?
Yeah, roughly speaking. It's a rough analogy. Don't quote me on that, but yeah. But did you see her? Well, actually, it wasn't her. There was a debate they were doing, and then the host actually fainted during the debate.
Because of how sexy they were?
No, not sufficient. Not sufficient sex appeal for that. No.
Oh, okay.
No, it's. I don't think they even said why exactly. It may have just been the studio was hot. It's been very hot in the UK recently. That's possible. But they didn't say exactly why. I just mention it because they actually had a video. You know, there was the debate was live. It was being broadcast, and the camera was on Liz Truss while she was answering a question about Ukraine. And then you just hear this loud thud and crash, and then she kind of, you know, stops talking. She just jumps because she's surprised, and then she walks off screen, and then you get one of those technical issues messages, you know, that pop up on screen. It was very strange, but very much in keeping with the era as far as weird shit happening. Did you see Boris Johnson resign officially?
I did not. You said he was dragging his feet about it quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it wasn't him. Okay, it wasn't the official, like, walking out of the prime minister's, what do they call it? The prime minister's residence. They have a special name for it. It slips my mind. So he's still technically prime minister. Now, what it was prime minister's questions. Have you heard of that?
No.
Well, that's a special period in which the prime minister comes to parliament and answers questions from parliamentarians. And it's kind of an old tradition, you know, all prime ministers partake of it. It's kind of expected of them. So this prime minister's questions session was his last before he steps down. And, you know, in his parting comments, he actually said, "Hasta la vista," which was just prototypically Boris Johnson corny. It's exactly what you would expect from him, but it didn't make it any less ridiculous. He also said he would.
What better way to announce your departure than to do a action movie hero one-liner?
He also said he'd be back.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he wasn't holding back. If you're gonna do it, you might as well go all in, apparently.
The cheese.
So yeah, UK politics as colorful as ever, basically. I guess since we're talking about Europe, did you see the stuff going on in Italy?
No.
Well, we talked before about how the government basically failed a vote of no confidence and there's going to be elections. So Mario Draghi, who had been prime minister, stepped down. He actually withdrew his resignation letter because he had a lot of support, it seemed, from the public. And so they actually tried for a new vote of confidence. But then before the vote, it became apparent that he was not going to get enough support to make it happen. That is to say, to pass the vote. So he ended up resigning again, for real this time. So they're going to have new elections after all. And from what I was reading, the most likely winner of the election, and the party that's probably going to lead the governing coalition, is a party called Brothers of Italy. Have you ever heard of them?
No.
Yeah, they used to be a far-right fascist party, or at least a far-right party, but they've apparently moderated considerably since then, supposedly. And one of their members is actually Mussolini's grandson, from what I recall.
Wow.
Yeah, so interesting connections there. A little disconcerting given the history, but they say that they're not going to significantly rock the boat per se. Apparently, there's a pretty decent number within both the Brothers of Italy and in allied political parties like the Liga that are more Euro-Atlanticist in outlook. That they're probably not going to significantly break with their European allies on big issues like Ukraine, energy, etc. So this isn't going to be like a major shift, a major break with the status quo. But it will be pretty significant in the sense that Italy has not had a far-right party in power since World War II, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to be new. So everybody's going to be keeping an eye on them to see just what that looks like. What does a far-right government in modern Europe look like, and what does it do?
Mm-hmm.
Again, their hands will be a little bit tied because they're going to require allies. They won't be able to govern on their own. Having a majority will require allies working with them, and so those allies will probably be more moderate than they will be. Will probably hold them back from anything too extreme that they want to do. So their hands will be bound in that regard. But of course, you could have said the same thing in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It didn't end too well then. So interesting times coming for Italian politics, one way or the other. Yeah, I think the leader of the Brothers of Italy is actually a woman. Her name is Maloney.
But they're not going to rename it to the Brothers and the Sisters of Italy.
No.
No.
No, I don't know how much you've read about far right parties, but they're not big on femininity.
Mm.
I've never heard of one that was. We didn't have any questions, did we?
Well, we had the Taiwan one. I'm not sure if chat had any while we've been going.
I think I was scrolling casually. Well, not scrolling, but I alt-tabbed briefly, and I think I saw one question about stopping Donald Trump from running for office. Something like that.
Hmm.
I don't think there's a concerted effort to stop Donald Trump running for office. I think the investigations on January 6th are just kind of their own thing. I mean, there was invariably going to be an investigation, and Donald Trump was obviously involved to some degree in the lead up to the January 6th, the riots or protests or whatever your preferred framing may be.
Mm-hmm.
So the investigations were always going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
If Donald Trump were convicted, I think technically that would bar him from running for president. But again, I don't think it's likely that they'll get a conviction. I don't even know if they'll bother prosecuting. Even if they did try to convict, the investigation, well, no, not the investigation. Even if they did try to convict, the trial would last so long that it would be meaningless. Like, even if he were guilty, the trial would take so long that he'll either win office again and then the trial ends, or the trial doesn't conclude until like years and years later after he's retired from politics or just died of old age. He's a pretty old guy. You kind of forget that sometimes.
Psh, I don't forget that. We've had super old people in politics for a long time.
Yeah, so he may last a while longer, but I wonder how long. I don't know, maybe he ends up like Bouteflika in Algeria, and he's still a major politician when he's 100 years old. I don't think it's going to work, though. He's not the most in-shape guy. It didn't even really work for Bouteflika. He was just so exhausted and enfeebled by the end that even he just could barely do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think people on Algeria's internet were making fun of the government for basically just putting him in a wheelchair and wheeling him around whenever they wanted to do like a PR thing. But
Mm-hmm.
that otherwise he had no real power. He was just like a symbolic figurehead. Hyperbolic criticism, but some truth to it. But yeah, other than that, I don't think anybody's really like conspiring to stop him from running. The January 6th investigation is probably the only thing that conceivably could. But beyond that, there's nothing that could really stop him. Maybe there's people in the Republican establishment who are trying to pressure him into not running again. I'm sure there's no small number of strategists in the Republican Party that would like to do so. It's not entirely clear he would actually be able to win the presidency if he did win. Biden is not very popular, but Trump himself is a very controversial candidate who may not be able to win the swing districts, especially in suburbs, which he lost pretty handily in the 2020 election. And those are kind of the ones you need in order to win right now.
Mm-hmm.
So if Trump did win, and the Democrats, well, if it were Trump versus Biden again, which would be hilarious,
It'll be
it would
so
be sad.
disappointing.
Yeah, it would be sad, but it would be hilarious. It would basically be two very unpopular candidates uh, fighting over suburbs, trying to convince them that which one was the less radical. And I don't think either would be able to present a very convincing argument. Yeah, I think there was a poll suggesting that most Democrats do not want Biden to run again.
To me, and this is just like personal take, it sort of feels like he was that compromise safe bet who he didn't really have the same charisma and consistency as Obama, but he was part of the Obama administration. So by people voting for him, it was kind of like a we would rather go back to an Obama-like administration, but it wasn't so much like we're excited about who Biden is and what he's going to bring to the table. I think people who voted for Trump were more excited, relatively speaking, about him being different and fresh in some way compared to the establishment. But yeah, for seeing Biden in office, it was kind of like a, yeah, I guess, but you're kind of going from a point of I guess to just him being really old and kind of past his prime and stuff. So it's not really someone you're excited to vote for. And we think about them running again. Come on, dude. Can we elect someone younger than 60 this time? That would be crazy.
Well, there's still time. Maybe Biden gets COVID and doesn't make it. Because he did test positive again recently.
Mm.
So he apparently has it again. So maybe we could yet end up with President Harris.
Did he say that he was going to run again? Because I thought he said that he would only do one, but people can change their mind, I guess.
He said that he wouldn't at one point while he was campaigning in 2020.
Uh-huh.
But then in later comments, he kind of walked it back and was more ambiguous.
Mm.
And since then, he hasn't really committed one way or the other. I doubt he will. I have to think that he'll not run for a second term. It just seems like it would be really hard on him physically, and given the issues with popularity, it doesn't really seem politically viable either. But at the same time, who else do they have to run? It's not exactly a deep bench at this point. You could run somebody like Elizabeth Warren's, maybe Bernie Sanders, one of the progressives. But then maybe that alienates the center. But then what kind of centrist Democrats are there? The Maltese guy? The guy whose name I could never pronounce no matter how hard I try? What is it? Booty? I always want to say Buttigieg, because I could have sworn I saw somebody write an article saying that was the proper pronunciation. But then somebody in chat was saying that it wasn't that. Buttigieg, maybe? Something like that? It's a Maltese name, whatever it is. So he's one of the centrist Democrats they could run. But he's also kind of not a very charismatic politician. I mean, he's been head of the Department of Transportation in the Biden administration, which is basically tantamount to being politically invisible. It's not the kind of position that comes up in the news a lot. So yeah, it's not clear just what they'll do. I'm sure they'll try to, if I had to guess, and I do, but just looking at the way the respective parties are strategizing right now, going by polling and going by what they've been doing in each other's races, I strongly suspect the Democratic Party is going to try to push for a centrist candidate again.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're probably going to end up alienating a lot of the progressive left, which may or may not blow up in their faces. It just kind of depends on how the progressive left reacts to that. But other than that, I couldn't tell you. My best guess is they'll try to pick a centrist candidate and back them, but I don't know who that would be. It's going to have to be somebody who can try to appeal to both the progressive left and the center left, but that's only getting harder as people just get more and more excited, so to speak, about politics. It seems like the stakes only ever get higher, so there's a lot of tension bound up in the outcome.
It seems like politics overall is shifting right then if the left is shooting for the center again.
Well, I mean, America in general kind of leans to the right anyway. Not just because of like the electoral map, but just in general, culturally speaking. So that kind of makes it relatively more difficult for a leftist coalition to win power. They're kind of always fighting uphill in that regard. The number of things that the different members of the Republican coalition have in common is much greater than the number of things that the leftist coalition members have in common. So that gives them an inherent edge. But yeah, I don't think anybody's really trying to stop Trump from running again. Probably the only thing that could realistically stop him would be like outright assassination. And I don't know how likely that is. It's possible, especially given that he's more of a known quantity now. I think there's relatively more people that would probably go to any extreme length in order to stop him from winning again. In 2020, you could say, yeah, he's an extreme candidate, but we don't know what he does. Maybe the Republican Party can keep him under control. But now it seems more likely that he's going to have much more influence over the party if he wins again. And he also has a lot more support. The January 6th events were kind of a stress test for loyalty amongst people in his administration. So now he knows who would be willing to go all the way with him and who would not be. So now, if he wins again, he can completely fill out his administration with pure loyalists and probably get away with a lot more than he did in his initial term. So that prospect would probably be pretty scary to a lot of people, including people within the establishment. So it's conceivable that one of them may go to extreme lengths to stop it, much more so than in 2020. So I would not rule that out. But overall, I think it would be unlikely. At least from what I know now.
Is there some kind of legal protection or immunity for president? I think I remember reading something about that, where if he did find himself in trouble, but then he won the presidency, would that insulate him or delay conviction kind of a thing?
Well, you mean like legal trouble?
Yeah.
So if he were convicted, then I think there are laws on the books that would prevent him from being president or even running. If he were to get into legal trouble while he was running or just before he was inaugurated, that would be legally freakish. It would be like the weirdest edge case. And I don't know that the laws are written for that. So you could end up with some minor constitutional crisis in that case. If it's something that happens while he's in office, that's easier, because then that just comes down to the normal impeachment process. And we've all seen how that works, or doesn't work, as you may perceive it. Yeah, it's just inherently hard to throw a president in jail. Partly that's by design. The courts are kind of, the way the laws are written is generally skewed in favor of giving the executive discretion and the benefit of the doubt as far as decision making. And that just has to do with trying to preclude the possibility of somebody trying to hobble the ability of the executive to perform its duties via litigation. You know, if you knew that you could remove a president just through litigation of some kind, then there's always an incentive for a hyper-partisan opponent of the president to destroy his presidency or even remove him of office by engaging in frivolous litigation. So in order to try to discourage that, they write the laws such that it's hard to do. But of course, the downside to that is that enough discretion is given to the presidency that it's much easier for them to get away with malfeasance. Mm-hmm. So there's a trade-off there between accountability for the president weighed against malfeasance amongst Congress, which has the option of hobbling a presidency if it wants to. If it has the option, as far as litigation, they could do that. So balancing those two opposing forces is a difficult balancing act. And in the United States, we tend to lean more towards a strong presidency, institutionally speaking. It works so long as your president is not a malcontent. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, sometimes they are, and then you end up with problems. So it goes.
We will see what happens. I, for one, would like to see some change. I'd like to see a young whippersnapper who's got some cool ideas and wants to basically address new issues. I think that we might see a lot more talk about climate as just a general topic for the next election. That's something that I'm interested in hearing about because it's fucking hot right now in a time and a place where it's not supposed to be this hot. So that's something that's going to be impacting everybody basically regardless of their political orientation.
Well, you're probably going to be disappointed.
Oh no.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if they did everything they could right now, the climate wouldn't change. I mean, it's kind of on a particular track. You know, what they're trying to do now is to prevent the worst outcomes 10, 20, 30 years from now. Mm-hmm. But as far as what can conceivably be done to change the course we're on within the next 10 years or so, that's a much more limited range of options.
Oh, yeah, I'm not expecting there to be, like, immediate results or anything for, okay, we changed this policy, now it's cool again. No, it's going to be pretty gnarly.
But even in terms of what can be done policy-wise, practically speaking, it's going to be really hard. Environmentalism is one of those things that I suspect will be sacrificed in order to reach a compromise. In Europe, it was immigration. Like a lot of center-left parties needed something that they could use to claw back voters from the center-right and populist parties. Mm-hmm. And eventually the thing that they gave up was immigration. And that was enough. But in the U.S., we're a lot more pro-immigration, so that's not as much of an issue. And it's not as useful as a bargaining chip as a result. So I suspect environmental policies will probably fill that role here in terms of bridging the divide between right and left. Mm-hmm. So that's not great for the environment or the climate, but it does leave the door open for compromises on other issues in the longer run. Mm-hmm. And what was it that was in the news recently? Joe Manchin actually did a thing. Did you hear about that?
He did a thing. What did he do?
Well, he announced that he was going to support a bill that had been under consideration. Mm-hmm. And he had been saying that, well, actually, it's basically the successor to the Build Back Better bill. You know, you remember that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a big bill. Joe Manchin kind of waxed and waned as to whether or not he would support it, and then finally he said that he wouldn't support it and that the bill was dead. So I kind of assumed that they would try to bring back some version of it, but it kind of seemed like they weren't. And the negotiations went quiet. But apparently they actually were trying to bring back part of the bill. Basically, they brought back what's called a skinny version of the bill, where they stripped out a lot of the meat and substance of it It still has a lot of substance, but the stuff that was causing problems with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, those things have largely been removed. So the skinny version of the bill will not do as much, but it will make tangible progress, and it probably will pass. I think it's already passed the House or will soon. The Senate has already passed it anyway. So that's will be a major accomplishment for the Biden administration and congressional Democrats if they can kind of put a bow on that and actually get it done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a fair amount of climate stuff involved. There's also some tax reforms and some other things here. I think as far as climate, the meat of it is tax credits. So there's a whole litany of tax credits that are written into the bill that are supposed to fund climate transition, basically. The idea being that there's new technologies that are cleaner than older technologies and that will produce fewer emissions. There we go. That's the right wording. And they want people to adopt that technology, but it's expensive, so they're going to subsidize it with these tax credits. So one of the tax credits is going to actually fund investment. Well, it'll either fund investment or production. Basically, it's going to fund the companies themselves that are going to be building this stuff. And you have a choice if you're, say, producing some new solar plant or whatever. You can get a tax credit on the investment cost, in which case you can cover up to 30% of the overall cost of the project, which is pretty substantive. Alternatively, you can get a tax credit that subsidizes production. So basically, well, not basically, the way it's written, you'll get a subsidy for every kilowatt hour. Sorry, you'll get a subsidy for every kilowatt hour of zero carbon electricity that you produce. So either way, they're going to get a subsidy, and that should make renewable energy relatively more competitive, and also more competitive in terms of cost, such that you'll see relatively more projects. I think the way it'll break down is that technology that's a little more raw, that can't really produce electricity, that can't really produce kilowatt hours at a cost competitive rate, will probably choose the tax credit for the kilowatt hours in order to try to become cost competitive. Whereas technology that's a little more well established and actually can produce competitive electricity will probably go for the investment tax credit, just to make the baseline project cheaper. That's a guess on my part. They've also got a bunch of tax credits for consumers. It looks like mostly in the form of rebates. So they're going to have a $7,500 rebate for new electric vehicle purchases. And that's going to scale with income. If you have beyond, I think, $150,000 for single filers, or $300K total income for couples. Beyond those levels, then you don't qualify for the rebate. And then I think there's also a phase in at some point. I don't have the number in front of me, but basically there's a level of income beyond which the amount of the rebate scales down. But regardless, there will be a rebate for EVs. It's only going to be eligible for, it's only going to apply for certain kinds of vehicles. And I think it was, what was it? SUVs, pickups, and vans. Yeah. It's not going to be as valuable if you use it for sedans and coupes, apparently. Let's see. And there's also going to be a $4,000 incentive. They didn't say specifically rebate, but they kind of inferred that it would be a rebate. So a $4,000 rebate for the purchase of used electric vehicles, which is the first time that's been done. And then they also are going to introduce anyway, 10 years of subsidies for households to buy heat pumps, electric water heaters, and rooftop solar panels. So basically greening households. And then I also have in my notes here $10 billion in funding for low-income citizens to be used to increase their home's energy efficiency and electrify key appliances. They didn't really specify what exactly was meant by that, but regardless, whatever that is, they've got $10 billion allocated for it. So some decent moves climate-wise. I think the tax credits for firms, the ones that I mentioned at the start, are probably going to be the more substantive ones. There's probably going to be a surge in production of renewable energy electricity projects, and that'll go a long way towards greening the economy right there. Since a lot of the way that people calculate, whether this, that, or the activity contributes to climate change is by way of electricity consumption, which is generally pretty dirty, relatively speaking. So if you can get clean energy production that produces electricity with renewable energy, then that has knock-on effects for the rest of the economy. Everything you produce with electricity then becomes cleaner by extension. So that's a pretty efficient way to do it overall. Now, there's probably more that can be done, but in terms of environmental economics, from what I was reading anyway, this is a very efficacious approach. Not very many distortions and a lot of encouragement and incentives for just baseline production of capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has to be one of the elements of basically pushing renewables is you have to make it a good deal for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can't really just say, hey, it would be more conscious for you to do this and we'd be really proud of you. Nope. You need a monetary incentive. There is a new sort of monetary incentive to go electric with your vehicle with the heckin' gas prices. I would guess that a lot more people are thinking about that as an option or some kind of hybrid.
Yeah.
Due to it.
Yeah, I've read that in India there's been a big surge in consumption of electric scooters and electric bikes because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So in some countries it's already happening. In the US, we're a little more resistant. We have higher incomes.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes relatively more to inculcate that kind of transition, but it's probably coming. Once the electric vehicles are sufficiently cost competitive, and once the infrastructure is there, it'll probably take off. Yeah, I suspect hybrids will probably be more popular at first,
Mm-hmm.
since the infrastructure is kind of already there for that. It won't take as long to charge, and there's already gas stations that sell gasoline, so that'll probably be less of a stretch, less difficult to transition to than just full-on electric vehicles. Yeah, let's see. There's some other stuff. They're going to raise the corporate income tax in the bill. They're going to cut taxes for high-income earners in blue states. That reverses a change that was made back in 2017. That was when the Republican Congress passed that big corporate tax cut.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways they paid for it was by making state income taxes, by no longer exempting state income taxes from federal income taxes. So before, you could basically say you could deduct the income taxes that you paid to your state from the income taxes that you paid to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So they ended that in 2017 to raise revenue for the big corporate tax cut. And there's been a lot of demand to try to reverse that since then. That's been a little controversial because even a lot of people in blue states think that's kind of catering to rich people. But regardless, it's been a big demand. And so they're going to reverse that change,
Mm-hmm.
or at least mitigate it. They're also going to close something called the carried interest loophole, which apparently is something that allows people to, specifically investment advisors, to, quote, treat a certain portion of their returns as capital gains instead of as income, end quote. So I haven't read as much about that, but I am familiar with the idea of capital income being treated differently than regular income. So I could see how that would be a pretty big loophole. So they'll raise some money there as well. Another thing that I thought was notable here is that they're going to cut out banks as middlemen. Historically, when they did subsidy programs like this, it was actually banks that would technically administer the subsidies and the loans. And that kind of created a problem because banks have different incentives. They're not always as interested in actually making a lot of loans to companies that the government wants them to lend to. So rather than worrying about what banks are going to do and whether or not people are going to lie in order to qualify for loans from banks that are getting subsidized by the government is going to give the subsidies directly to companies and consumers. So cutting out the middleman will save them some grief there. If you want an example of how banks are bad middlemen for government policy, one example is the Payment Protection Program. Back during the height of the pandemic in 2020, that was a program the government initiated in order to try to disincentivize companies from firing workers. They wanted companies to keep on as many people as possible so that they could keep their jobs and their incomes. But what happened in practice is that companies just lied. In fact, some people made fake companies and applied for money and got it and just took the money and ran. So there was a huge amount of graft that happened in that program because of a lack of vetting, basically, for the people applying for the loans and money as part of the program. And banks were the ones that administered that money, and they obviously did not give a sufficient amount of shit in order to really vet the people applying more. You know, to be fair, the government could have required it. They could have written that into the law, but they didn't. You know, they were focused on getting the law written and passed as soon as possible, and as a result, it wasn't very well constructed. That was thought to be a pretty fair trade-off at the time, but in retrospect, it ended up being even more inefficient than I had assumed it would be back in 2020. Hindsight is 2020, but still, that was a bad bill. That went very poorly. They're going to do something different this time. Now it's just going to be subsidies directly to people and firms.
Nice.
Apparently, it's also been a problem historically for utilities to qualify for subsidies like this. You know, historically, the subsidies have kind of been, they've been sort of siloed. That's the word I want. So they would create a subsidy here for a specific technology and a different kind of subsidy for a different technology, and all of them would be written at different times, and they would do different things. And it was basically just what would you call it? It was like a crazy quilt of different subsidies all over the place. And not everybody qualified for the same subsidy that might qualify for another one that was subsidizing similar technologies. So they've tried to rationalize the whole regime of subsidies here for green technology. And one of the ways that they've done that is making sure that utilities can apply for pretty much all of them. You know, before they didn't always qualify, they'd been more targeted at private companies, but utilities obviously produce a lot of electricity, so it would be very helpful for them in terms of paying for their transition to cleaner electricity producing technology to have access to that money. And so the bill is written in a way to ensure that's going to happen. So that should also help a lot.
I don't know why, but this just reminded me of something that I forgot to ask you about. I don't know if we mentioned it last time. I know we didn't do an Agent Smith last week, but the Canadian internet outage. They lost internet across the country for a pretty long amount of time, I think due to a sort of monopoly that one of the companies or a couple of them have on people's internet, and it took a while to fix it. There wasn't really any government fallback system that people could use. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, Canada has a kind of, it's not a monopoly because there are multiple companies, but it's only three.
Mm-hmm.
And the government goes out of its way to give them special privileges and subsidies to ensure they can stay competitive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from what I was reading, the reason the Canadian government does it like that, instead of just opening it up to competition, is that they don't want foreign companies to be in control of their ISPs. So Canadian companies, maybe Canadian companies with partnerships with foreign companies, but purely Canadian companies are basically running their internet up there. And that's by design. You know, the government doesn't want to have a foreign country of some kind hold the nation's access to the internet hostage for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So the upshot is that they have more autonomy in that regard. You know, all of the companies are Canadian, are subject to Canadian laws. But the downside is that they're not as competitive as they would be otherwise if they actually just opened up the market. So basically the cost of having Canadian companies in charge, and only Canadian companies in charge of the internet, is that everybody has to pay slightly more in premiums.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not premiums, but in terms of their monthly fee for internet access, they have to pay more. And also there are problems with reliability, since, you know, competition is not as much of a concern for them, given that they're more or less they are state-backed companies. So service is not the first priority. You know, it's not like the Canadian government is just going to kick them out. Like, if they do, then what?
Mm-hmm.
You know, It's not like there's a ready supply of ISPs ready to take their place necessarily. It takes a lot of expertise and capital to do what they do. So they get a lot of discretion. They can kind of get away with being somewhat substandard.
That doesn't sound very good to me. But I can see why, I guess for security purposes, you wouldn't want to have another company like messing with your viewers. And then there's your consumers. There's also the process of ISPs have a lot of informational power of what people are browsing and what they're doing. Like if they want to look at that stuff, they can. So yeah, I think vetting the ISPs makes sense. It's just kind of silly and unfortunate that something that the reason I thought of it was utilities. Internet can be thought of as a utility where humans should have it. It's basically necessary for a lot of people to work and that kind of a thing. So why does it need to be so price gougy and low quality when we have the technology to more or less just give people good internet pipes? Definitely something that Kukyo would have had a lot of words to say about.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah, some places are better about it than others. India almost had universal free internet access. Came with some caveats, though. It was going to be owned by Facebook.
Oh.
Yeah, Facebook would have been basically the common man's window to the internet if Facebook had gotten their way. It wasn't entirely a bad deal. I mean, free internet is free internet, right? But the government was not very comfortable with one company having that much power over its users.
Yeah. I don't think I would like the sound of that either.
Yeah, there's been a couple of tech companies experimenting with broad-based internet access. I don't know that any of them have really panned out well. Maybe Starlink was maybe the most successful one. The idea is providing internet access to remote areas that don't have a lot of telecommunications infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So Starlink was one way of doing it. You could just give them the Starlink and they can connect via satellite. There was another one, I don't remember which company it was, but basically the idea is that they would put like routers, I guess. They were almost like mini satellites, and they were going to float them on balloons. And they were going to float them in the upper stratosphere. And the idea was to float so many of them that they could form a network unto themselves that would allow people to connect to the internet. Yeah, I think that ended up failing. But yeah, it's been different experiments. Yeah, going back to this bill here, another thing they're going to do is they're going to allow, I hope I read this right, they're going to allow Medicare to negotiate directly with drug makers in order to get lower prices for Medicare users. So that'll be a nice change. They should be able to negotiate much lower prices. Given how many people use Medicare, that's a pretty decent chunk of the market. Drug makers are not very excited about that. Yeah, before drug prices were basically calculated using a formula that were predicated on averages of prices on the market. And so Medicare couldn't quite get the low prices that they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But now they should be able to bring the full monopsony power of a huge provider like Medicare to bear. And they should be able to negotiate some pretty good discounts.
Yeah, that would be something that a lot of people would prefer, is cheaper healthcare costs in the U.S.
Yeah. I was talking with Moss about that the other day.
Mm-hmm. It feels like a scam. We do have some high-quality doctors and stuff, so the capacity for getting the best healthcare in the world is here, but then just for the standard rate for people, it's pretty ridiculous. I was hearing a little bit about the debt that doctors take on going through med school and how they aren't actually quite as rich as people think they are, in the sense that for much of their career they're just amassing like hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, and then they have to work that off, and then only after all of that do they start to make the good money and actually bank up stuff, so they could be in their mid 40s to 50s by the time that they're buying a boat and stuff like that. So definitely a very difficult profession that requires a lot of expertise and training, difficult environments, crazy hours, a ton of knowledge, and it's also something that's directly impacting people's health and livelihoods. So some tough stuff. Big respect to people who go that route.
Yeah, I think I knew a guy like that who did that. I haven't talked to him in a long time. Well, maybe I should message him or something. But yeah, very difficult profession. A little bit scammy sometimes.
What do you mean a little bit? Yeah, one of the things that's been a critique for my family is the incentive for doctors to prescribe certain medications because they get a deal from the company who makes it. So it's good for them if they prescribe it more liberally rather than to look for more holistic or behavioral methods for people to work on their health. It's like you could just take a pill and that's going to change your situation a little bit, or you could change your habits somewhat, which doesn't give them any money aside from the office visit. And selling them the pill is oftentimes just better revenue, but not necessarily the healthiest choice for the consumer.
And there's also the American Medical Association. They do a good bit of lobbying in Washington. Yeah, they could produce more doctors every year if they wanted to, but they don't. And nobody can really make them.
What is the step where they get to block people from being a doctor?
Well, basically, they can limit the number of positions available in medical schools. There's only so many. So it's relatively difficult to get into medical school. It would make more sense to have more positions in the medical schools and also to open up more medical schools, but that doesn't really happen much. And so there's kind of an artificial block there in terms of the supply of doctors that are being produced every year.
I did not know that.
Yeah, the U.S. generally gets around it by importing doctors. Like if you get a medical degree overseas, especially in a developed country, you can come over here and practice medicine. So we don't really have like broad-based shortages like we might if we were solely dependent on our own doctors. But yeah, if we were cut off from foreign doctors, there would be problems. You would definitely notice it then.
My pediatrician growing up was Indian. Good doctor.
Yeah, India produces a lot. Yeah, India has good educational institutions. India's trouble is that they don't have very many other good institutions. They can pump out really highly trained engineers and doctors, but political institutions, economic management, those things are not really quite up to snuff, and the result is that the economy underperforms. And so a lot of those professionals struggle to find work in their own country. And so frequently they're pushed out and have to go elsewhere. If India ever figures its shit out, it would be a powerhouse. But it's just very difficult. A lot of institutional inertia there.
Just takes a long time to update stuff.
Well, no, there's just institutional blocks. Like, when India became independent, when India became independent, there we go, the dominant ideology amongst members of the Indian National Congress, which was the party that was leading the independence movement in India, was really very left-wing. Their perspective on the proper way to manage an economy and to develop an economy, for that matter, which is more relevant to India at the time, was very much centered on the state and state activity and state direction. And the result of that is that the state ended up intervening quite a bit in the Indian economy. And to a degree, that was useful. They were able to pretty rapidly scale up certain key strategic industries But the downside is that it inculcated a very slow, lethargic, bureaucratic approach to dealing with economic problems. And the result of that was what came to be called the Permit Raj. That was basically just a regime of permits and paperwork that slowed everything down, and it made it very difficult to form businesses, find capital, really just to do anything. And it wasn't until the early 1990s that they changed that and deregulated the economy to make it more open. And, that succeeded in significantly improving the economy of India. There was a lot of growth that was generated after that. But that transformation was never complete. It's not as though they completely deregulated the economy or liberalized it. They just opened up space. And, Indian people are just so entrepreneurial in general, they were able to make a lot of that space. But there's a lot more room to improve there. But they just don't want to, because there's so much political resistance to liberalizing the economy amongst voters. Factory workers, for example, they like keeping their benefits, labor protections. Farmers like their subsidies. They like having guaranteed insurance and guaranteed loans. Local states will actually guarantee the loans to farmers and ensure that the interest rates are very low. And, that's great, but India is a mostly agricultural economy and that has a population of over 1 billion people. So those kinds of subsidies add up quite a bit. On an individual basis, not that much, but for 1 billion plus people, yeah, that'll bust your budget pretty quickly. So lots of little things like that add up and just create problems for the economy. It slows it down, it slows down innovation, it discourages people from innovating and modernizing. Indian agriculture in particular has been a victim of this, because the impetus for India's political system has been to ensure that farmers are protected, which is great, but it also means that they're not really incentivized to modernize their approach to farming. Like, the industry is very backwards in India in a lot of places. There's been some progress over time, but in general, it's not nearly as efficient as it needs to be. Part of that is also due to the fact that the Indian government, upon independence, really wanted to focus on manufacturing. That was almost a prestige item for them. A lot of development economists told them, hey, you should focus on agriculture. That's the biggest part of your economy. Modernize that first, and then the urbanization and manufacturing sector will follow naturally. But the Indian government said, no, the only reason you think that is because you're racist. You think that Indians are incapable of developing their own manufacturing sector. Actually, we're going to focus on that first, and we're going to prove you wrong. So that was a bad move. They really should have focused on agriculture first. Now, the result of focusing on manufacturing in the mid-20th century is that India ended up with a heavy machinery industry and various other subsidiary and related industries. And they're somewhat self-sufficient in goods that fall under the category of light manufacturing. But overall, they're still technologically way behind Western manufacturing. And that means that a lot of the industries are dependent on subsidies and are relatively inefficient. There's some industries that are efficient. Usually they're the privately owned ones, Tata Industries, etc. But those are a relatively small part of the economy compared to the sections of the broad swaths of the economy, really, that are controlled by state-owned industries or state-backed industries. And India has a lot of those. The national government has industries that it owns, and even the state-level governments have industries that, well, not industry, companies, I should say. The national government owns whole companies, and then the state-level entities also own their own companies. So if you're just a private sector competitor, it can be very hard to compete with those kinds of entities, because of course they get the benefit of subsidies, whereas you as a private sector actor are just kind of on your own. So agriculture has really not modernized very much, and the manufacturing sector, because it's so heavily subsidized, is not very competitive. So all told, the Indian economy kind of really struggles. And again, everybody wants protection. Everybody wants to maintain the status quo because they all have an incentive to. So politically speaking, it's hard to find the political willpower to go against the constituents' wishes and try to implement reforms that will be difficult in the short term, but which pay off more in the medium to long term. There's also a lot of bureaucracies in India that uphold the status quo, that are responsible for dispensing subsidies, managing subsidies, state-owned banks, state-owned companies generally. All of these are basically bureaucracies that have an inherent interest in maintaining the status quo. So in that sense, the civil service in India has incentives to kind of slow walk any attempt at liberalizing reforms. They don't really have a lot of interest in doing that. And so there's a lot of opposition from key political figures that are responsible for those bureaucracies. Keep in mind also that government jobs are one of the most attractive and desired jobs in India. As I've kind of illustrated, the private sector struggles to generate enough jobs for everybody. And what private sector jobs there are do not provide a lot of job security. Certainly not much in the way of things like pensions for retirement or whatnot, or other sort of goodies like that. But government jobs do provide that. Government jobs are considered to provide a high degree of job security, and they provide pensions for retirement, among other benefits. So everybody wants a government job, and so as a result, there's a political demand to produce more government jobs. And therefore, there's an incentive to expand the bureaucracy almost indefinitely to try to ensure that your constituents have access to the kinds of government jobs that they're looking for. So there's a lot of problems there, like institutionally for India, as far as managing its economy, that make it very difficult to implement these kinds of reforms that would actually generate more growth and more job opportunities in the long run, and would allow more of the educated experts that India produces, engineers, doctors, what have you, to actually find jobs in India.
It seems like it's due to them favoring stability over risk and innovation. So it stagnates everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, India was never as bad as like the Soviet Union, for example, or the PRC before Deng Xiaoping's reforms. But it definitely had a lot of the same issues as far as having a relatively centralized economy. Also, there's a lot of regulations as far as how much doctors can be compensated. So doctors don't make as much money in India as they could if it were more of a free market system. And the result of that is that lots of doctors who maybe could find a job in medicine in India don't really have much incentive to. You can make way more money abroad. Also, those Indian doctors that do stay in country have a big incentive to take bribes. So that's apparently also not an uncommon problem.
Bribe to do what?
Their job.
Oh.
Yeah. They don't have to pay all that much attention. They can kind of half-ass it if they want to, and you won't necessarily know the difference. So if you really want them to take care of you, or if you want them to produce maybe some supplies or medicine that you need, but is maybe in short supply, maybe you can pay them a little bribe and suddenly they find it.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar in China. China actually has the same problem. I actually have a friend who had a relative who was hospitalized, and they had to pay the who was it? I think it was the manager of the hospital, like a really large bribe in order to actually take care of their relative. Because before they'd been saying, oh, well, there's nothing we can do, sorry. And they gave them an envelope, and he was like, well, maybe there was something we can do. And they had to give them another envelope, and he said, okay, well, I think we can keep an eye on him for the next couple weeks.
I'm sorry, sir. His situation, it's far too critical. There's nothing we can do. He's doomed. But could I interest you in this? Actually, I think there's hope for him.
Yeah, it's true. It's all good and well to try to keep to keep medical costs down by limiting salaries, but you're generally going to have some kind of personnel problem there, be it with bribery or people who don't care about the job or people just outright leaving the country to get higher pay elsewhere. Yeah, that's the issue there with India.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. Let me see if I can backtrace this. India doctors, medical care in the United States.
Mm-hmm. He's got it.
Here we go. Oh, that's what it was. Medicare negotiating directly with drug makers. Yeah, that's going to be in the new law as well. So you may wonder, why did Joe Manchin change his mind about this bill? Why did he suddenly announce that he was going to support it after all? So besides the fact that they pulled out a lot of the stuff in there, they made it a much cheaper bill, which allows him to paint himself as a fiscally responsible politician, which is important in West Virginia politics. There's also some compromises within the bill. And the chief compromise that I have in my notes here, there are two items. One is a requirement that the government open up new locations for oil and gas leasing in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. So that's a requirement. They're going to have to do that as part of the bill. So you'll see relatively more exploitation there, or at least the possibility of more exploitation there. And then the other compromise, well, I should say the other concession, was that renewable development on federal property is going to be tied to fossil fuel development. So basically, what I have here is, and I can just give you the quote, one of its provisions forbids the government from selling leases to install solar or wind on federal land or seafloor when it has not also recently opened territory to oil and gas developers. So you can sell leases for federal land for renewable energy development, but there has to be matching leases basically for fossil fuels development.
That's interesting. I guess that makes it a lot more likely to pass since the fossil fuel industry has majority power and momentum historically.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Joe Manchin is in a coal-producing state. He wants the fossil fuel industry to, at the very least, not implode, if not expand. So this compromise very much fits his state's needs.
Yeah.
And technically, it does facilitate at least some renewable energy development. So it's got that going for the environmentalists.
Yeah. One of the things that I feel like I've heard from a lot of people who are more pro-oil is that we have a lot of the raw resource in the continental United States and in Alaska, where we have stuff that we could harvest and use as energy. It's there. And the effects of climate change and stuff are less obvious than the dollar amount that you get from ripping the oil from the ground or the coal or whatever and then selling that. Like, that's a lot more tangible of, we just got this amount of business from it, than, okay, we had 1 degree less temperature in this place this year. That's a lot more nebulous. I had one viewer a couple weeks ago who was trying to basically grill me on not liking oil enough, but I was really confused as to why they're trying to get me to be pro-oil. Like, what can I do as a consumer? The only major thing would be to use my platform to influence people to be more pro-oil, but that doesn't seem like it helps me at all. They were really into it. Yeah, it was like almost like someone who works for some oil company who is trying to get me to think a certain way.
This like some new PR strategy by
if they want to get a sponsorship, they should ask me like a professional. Shell want to sponsor me, they better throw heaps of money because I'm not keen. You would need to give me a good reason. Silly.
Well, just to say, maybe Twitch will be sufficiently popular one day to make it happen.
Wouldn't be my first choice of a company to push.
Yeah, for the right money, I think anybody would be willing to do it. And the oil industry does have a lot of money.
They have heaps of money.
Yeah. Well, we doing okay on time?
We could go for another 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. It is hella hot for me, which has the unfun knock-on effects of sleep is less good at night. Sleeping in a cold room, the best. Sleeping in an 85-degree room, no. It's not the best.
No, it is not.
No.
Yeah, I can see how that would be uncomfortable.
We're supposed to get to a high of 80 tomorrow, which will be a lot more palatable.
What was the... You've heard of RimWorld, right?
Yes, that was your alcoholic cat.
You still remember the alcoholic cat.
We asked about it. We had questions for Agent Smith. They're worried about your cat, man.
Well, one of the things you can do in RimWorld in order to control temperature is build this item. It's one of the earliest things you can build. But I'm having trouble remembering what it was. Basically, it just evaporates water. I think that's the gist of it. Somebody in chat probably knows what I'm talking about. Buildings. What was it? But maybe you could build something like that. Something that just evaporates water, and maybe that'll help cool things off a little bit.
Swamp cooler?
Swamp cooler? I don't think that's it. Passive cooler.
You're saying that I need to play RimWorld to cool my house?
No. Well, I mean, the stuff in the game is generally real, especially the low-tech stuff. So I think that is a thing you can do. I just don't know, like, how effective it is. Anyway, probably not the best game to be taking survival tips on, given how many people die whenever you play it.
Yeah. I've been playing a board game called Kingdom Death. I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but that's what I was doing last Sunday. And it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, except the characters die on a very regular basis, and the win condition is the village overall winning. So you kind of cycle through characters who go on hunts together, and they face monsters kind of like you would in Dungeons and Dragons, with movement rules and attack rules and all this kind of stuff, and you roll for stuff. But you'll have a character who maybe does some epic stuff in a fight, and they get a kill, they get some cool items, they get some stats and courage and understanding through that. And then there's a settlement event, a stranger visits the camp, and they heckin' kill your character. And they just die, and that's just part of the event. But as long as you've been reproducing to sustain the population, your campaign continues. So I think we have like 12 people in the village, and we have 26 deaths so far. So we've cycled through quite a few people. It has a very dark and gritty feel to it, where you have mixed feelings of a fight that was really close, but maybe one of your favorite characters died. Yeah, it's a cool game. Definitely fun to play. And it's all tracked in a phone app, so you can save your items and the status of all your characters and things between sessions. So we've been working on a campaign of that now for like 4 weeks. So we're about in the mid-game for it.
Oh, that sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
What was it called?
Kingdom Death.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. It's pretty expensive. It's like a big scale game with a lot of different parts and expansions that you can buy, which are basically different monsters and items and that kind of a thing.
Oh, wow. Some thick girls in there.
Yeah. I think it's called boutique horror is the genre. That's where the boutique comes from.
So wait, it's a board game that has its own app?
Yeah. There's a phone app that tracks the stuff, basically, so you don't have to pencil and paper write everything down and then erase everything.
I see. Okay.
It's very good for keeping track of multiple sessions and saving paper.
So it's not like one of those online social game things.
No, I don't think you can play it online, or at least I haven't heard of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's all set up on a big tabletop and stuff. You can paint your models and that kind of thing. They all just arrive as like a stock gray, and then you can paint them if you want to.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember a million years ago, I played some kind of social game. It was an online thing that was hosted on the developer's website.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was called Mush. Basically, the idea is that you and some other people are crew on a ship that has one imposter on it. And no, it's not Among Us. This is way before Among Us. And the way it was set up is that, you could do different things on the ship and whatnot, and the whoever was the alien had to sabotage the mission and kill everybody or convert them into an alien.
Mm.
And it wasn't a game you had to install. It was literally just something you played online. I thought it was an interesting business model. I hadn't heard of that before at the time.
Mm-hmm. How did they make money? Advertisements?
Advertisements, and there was stuff you could buy. You could get like points. It was kind of pay to play a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little better in that there was stuff you could just get just by playing. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, principally they would make money by people buying stuff, items, whatnot, things for utility.
In-game transactions. Oh my.
Not quite in game, more like before game. But yeah, same idea.
Yeah. Did you hear about Diablo Immortal and the?
Yes, I've heard quite a bit about Diablo Immortal and
Yeah.
how much money they've made.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can complain all you want, but if it works, they're going to keep doing it.
It does work. I was praising StarCraft a little bit for staying true to only having cosmetic in-game microtransactions. That's really nice. Dota 2 is the same way, where you can get awesome skins, and some of them it's like $300 and you get this axe for this character. CSGO, I think, also does that. Counter-Strike, you can get fancy guns that are worth a crap ton of money. But to me, if you're looking at the item, it doesn't really change what is satisfying to me about it too much. I do like a skin. Like if there's a character that I think is kind of not very aesthetic and they have a really cool skin, I'm more likely to play it if I have a skin that I like. But the huge purchase of hundreds of dollars for some item that's really rare, it doesn't really change the glory of winning in the match. Like what's most fun for me is to be able to win and beat somebody when it's a pretty close match. But style does count for something. And some people who are more casual, I think they just like that collector aspect of you get to kit out your stuff and make it look all really cool. So when you're playing, you look awesome. That's valid, as long as you don't give people advantages in the game. But I think with Diablo Immortal and some other games, they gate a lot of the content and the powerful items behind money. But you could potentially grind it and spend a massive amount of time.
Yeah, hypothetically.
Yeah. In practice, you would need to be a full-time gamer of that game to get those items, which doesn't feel very fair to me.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
But it's not about fairness.
No, it's about profit. Let's go.
It's about ROI.
Yes, return on that investment.
Yeah, so here's looking forward to Blizzard's transformation into a mobile game maker.
Yeah. They've had a really interesting arc. I think one of the things that someone pointed out was that a lot of companies, after they reach maturity, they're a lot less about their initial purpose and the passion of the employees in the company, and it's more about how do we extract value from this monster that we've created. So if you're looking at like the early innovative games of the Warcraft series, World of Warcraft, the initial game, whenever StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 were made, there's a lot of that pioneering and people who are trying to make the new level of game that hasn't been made before, and they had a really, really strong name. Obviously, there's probably some office culture stuff that was bad behind the scenes, but they basically won the community's heart, where people love the name of Blizzard, and then over time just focusing more on extracting value and less so on innovating and just giving people the stuff that's going to end up generating the most money. But from the business side of things, that's basically what I do. You like feed the cow to make it really healthy and large, and then you milk the cow and get the dairy from it, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we've entered the cow milking phase, less than the growing phase of making it big and strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just the path of least resistance for them.
Have you heard of Stormgate?
A little bit. That's supposed to be the new RTS, right?
Yeah, one of them. There's also Immortal Gates of Pyre. Stormgate is interesting in that it's kind of like Sauron in the ring of, even though it was killed, its soul escaped into another place. The developers of StarCraft 2, like the people who are just straight up on the dev team, they pretty much moved over there because they axed the team. So StarCraft 2 used to have a full team where you've got co-op design, multiplayer design, skins, and all this other stuff, community management. Now we have a bare bones. We joke about it being an intern. There's one intern who works on StarCraft 2 now just to flip the switch every now and then. But yeah, a lot of the big names who built StarCraft 2 are on the Stormgate team, so they know what they're doing, and they're going for a lot of similar stuff. So I think a lot of people in the StarCraft scene are really looking at Stormgate to be the next thing, basically to be the StarCraft 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's hoping.
Hell
It's been a while since there's been a big new RTS, hasn't it?
Yeah, there was Dune Spice Wars, which people have told me to play. I might look into that at some point. I do like Dune. I've read the book for that, and the movie is really good. If you want to watch a sci-fi movie that's not cheesy and not very dialogue driven.
Which one?
The new one. I think
the David Lynch one?
The David Lynch one is also good. I have seen that one. The new Dune movie is fantastic. It's very visually driven. It's got a cool aesthetic to it. The thing that really alarmed me about it was that it's not the whole book, the first movie. I thought it was like gonna tell the whole story of it, and then it just says directed by. And I was like, what the fuck?
Oh, wow.
Oh, it's over.
I mean, it makes sense given how big the story is.
Yeah, true.
I remember buying the book when I was a kid, and it was like this big tome.
Yeah.
So there's plenty there.
Definitely a good one.
For them. I'll have to give that a try.
Yeah, I would say
watch. I'm way behind on movies.
It felt true to form. I also watched Thor: Love and Thunder. That was pretty standard Marvel stuff. It wasn't as good as Thor Ragnarok. Did you see the new Batman yet?
No, I have not.
That one is similar to Dune in the sense that it's not super dialogue driven, and it has a lot of environment shots. So if you're thinking about the different kinds of Batmans there have been, this Batman focuses a lot on the environment of Gotham, which is cool. Emo Batman, they say in chat. Yeah, he's less macho and gung-ho as the Christian Bale. Christian Bale Batman is like the super ninja he's got a lot of anger, and he converts that into ass-kickery. This Batman is more focusing on the trauma and the isolation of the role of being Batman and what happened to him in his youth. Yeah. Different angle, still good.
Wasn't there a new Top Gun movie?
Yes. Yeah, that one actually made the news because of Taiwan.
Yeah. I did hear about that, but is it any good?
I heard it was good. I haven't seen it yet. My parents saw it and they liked it. They said, I was asking him, like, who's the villain in it? Because we kind of have that question of, for media, what country in modern context do we make the villain? And I think it was supposed to be kind of unclear, but someone was trying to develop some kind of weapon and they've got to stop it.
Oh, yeah.
But, yeah.
That's kind of what they did in the first one.
Yeah, I think so. I thought they were like Russian or Soviet or something, but maybe I'm wrong.
They were cagey about it.
Yeah.
They were purposely cagey about it. I don't think it was actually Russians. It was more like Russian-aligned countries flying Russian aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what it was. Although maybe I'm misremembering.
Mm-hmm.
It's always politic to be ambiguous about your villains and stuff like that.
True. But yeah, I felt like that was a pretty big move for Tom Cruise and them to say, no, we're keeping the Taiwan patch. That's a lot of money that they said no to.
Well, to be fair, I don't know that China would have allowed them to show it anyway. I mean, what is it? China only allows 11 Hollywood films a year,
Oh, really?
something
I
like.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it's restricted. They don't just allow anybody to buy and show a
Ah.
movie in China. There's the Chinese government has agreements with the major studios about how many American movies they can show, and so they purposely plan out which movies they plan to show in China, and they cater them to the market.
Hmm.
But there's other films that they know aren't going to be sold in China, and so they don't give a shit, about those so much. You can be more or less as anti-China as you want in a lot of films.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely true that there is some censorship. You can't go too overboard because nobody wants the Chinese government to get mad at them and cut the number of films they're allowed to show.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the government is mostly concerned about movies that actually are shown in China, and so most of Beijing's focus is on making sure that the few firms that are allowed to be shown actually meet all censorship requirements. Beyond that, don't really give too much of a shit. Yeah, maybe the only exception is if like you make the Chinese explicitly the villain, like in that Red Dawn movie. You
Mm-hmm.
remember that?
Mm-hmm.
They shot that whole movie. It was a remake of the 1980s movie Red Dawn. And China was the antagonist, like they were the country invading the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But then the studio got cold feet. Beijing kind of complained a little bit, and that was enough. And so they went back and they digitally adjusted every scene, every shot in the movie to make the antagonist North Korea, which doesn't really make any sense since I'm pretty sure there's no way North Korea could invade the United States.
Yeah.
But they did it. They did it like as a desperation move.
Huh.
And I think they also had to redub the Chinese dialogue into Korean for that reason.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's one of the more prominent examples of Chinese influence over Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Generally when people complain about Hollywood being too close to China, that's one of the examples that gets brought up.
Mm.
But I don't know that that's like a normal example. Like that's not generally what happens. Again, that was kind of a weird outlier because like how many movies involve a foreign country invading the United States?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty rare. Like most of them are sort of Oscar bait, where somebody does a thing with their wife, and now everybody's mad at them, and people are upset, and wah, whatever drama, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody wins an Oscar because they were really good at pretending to cry.
Oh.
It's that kind of stuff China doesn't care about, even if there's maybe some scenes in China or Chinese character, or maybe some Chinese characters even.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, so long as like there's nothing explicit as far as China or making China look like really, really bad, they don't care. And because most movies don't involve China anyway, it's very rarely a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some issue with Hollywood self-censorship, but it's not as bad as some people make it out to be.
Chad is saying with regards to the Top Gun movie that the enemy was using Su-57s, and those
Russian.
are Russian design and made, yeah. But multiple countries probably use those, so it wouldn't make it definitively Russian, right?
No, pretty much Russia's the only one that would use the 57. Although I
Oh,
don't
is
think
that
that's
their more modern one?
Yeah, that's one of the more modern ones, but that's also not being mass produced yet. I
Oh,
didn't think. So what, is the movie set in the future or something? Like a near future kind of thing? That would make more sense to me.
could be.
Well, maybe Hollywood just wanted the coolest looking jet they could find in the Russian arsenal.
Yeah. I think cool jets are awesome. I know they're super expensive to make, but the engineering of getting something to go that fast and handle that well and have that much firepower is crazy. Just the little
Yeah.
kid voice in your head. Plane's cool, yeah.
You see, what they should have done is they should have gone for the Su-47.
Mm-hmm.
That's the coolest looking one. That's got the forward swept wings.
Wait, which one did you say?
Su-47. That's also not mass produced. It's kind of more of an experimental design, but
Oh.
it's always looked really cool. I think it's popped up in a lot of video games.
Yeah, that is a cool one. Su-57 though.
Kind of looks suspiciously familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. Has the similar body shape to a lot of American planes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a guy who has an aeronautics channel on YouTube, and he made the. Somebody actually asked him, why do so many fourth gen jets look the same? And his answer basically is convergent evolution. Like a lot of the same design features appear on the same aircraft because stealth requires a lot of the same features. Like those are all optimal features as far as maximizing the stealth of the aircraft. And so everybody just uses them. So unfortunately, there's not as much diversity in terms of aesthetics, so to speak, of modern aircraft. They tend to look pretty similar. It was more fun back in the day when there was a little more variance in terms of design.
Yeah. What's the Blackbird one?
Oh, the SR-71?
Yeah. I had a little action figure thing of one of those. The shape of this one is heckin' unique. Looks like a rocket ship.
Yeah, that required a lot of technological breakthroughs. Yeah, nobody had really flown sustained Mach 3 before that aircraft was developed. So they had to develop special engines that could handle the weird physics that happen at Mach 3. The air kind of behaves a little differently. They pulled it off, though. So do you know why they originally designed it?
I think it was supposed to be a recon vessel that can fly super high, like higher than anything else, and take pictures more so than bombing shit.
Close. Yeah, it was reconnaissance, but it wasn't meant to fly particularly high.
Oh.
The aircraft it replaced was called the U-2. Maybe you remember that. The U-2 was specifically designed to fly high, and the idea was that it would fly so high that it would fly over air defense systems. Even if you tried to hit it with a missile, it would be too high for you to hit. And it was used to take pictures of sensitive sites in the Soviet Union, among other places. So the trouble was that the Soviets developed new missile technology that actually did have the range to shoot it down. And eventually they did. And that was the famous incident in the mid-1950s in which Gary Powers was captured. Gary Powers was the pilot of the U-2 they shot down. He survived the crash and was taken prisoner. And the Soviets had quite the field day at the United Nations, making the point that the United States was violating the airspace, spying on them. Yeah, that was the lead up to the famous picture, well, the famous video of Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union at the time, banging his shoe on the table at the UN, screaming that he's going to bury the Americans. He was upset about it. He was also kind of a ham. But yeah, the SR-71 was designed to replace the U-2, and rather than flying over air defense systems, it was designed to outrun them. The idea is that an aircraft flying sustained Mach 3 would be able to outrun any missile that was shot at it.
Yeah, if you could fly faster than the missiles, then it doesn't matter if they shoot missiles at you.
Yeah, exactly. That was the idea. And it worked for a while, but I don't think they flew over the Soviet Union anymore. I think that was seen as too risky. But they definitely used them in other sensitive places. Yeah, I think eventually the missile technology kind of caught up to it. Know what it was? It wasn't the missile technology, it was the spy satellites. The development of spy satellites with extremely high-definition cameras actually obviated the need for aircraft to do those kinds of reconnaissance missions.
Right.
So you could, if you wanted to take pictures of a sensitive site, why bother with an aircraft? You could just fly a satellite over it, and it'll take pictures that are actually just as high quality as the pictures you could have taken with an aircraft.
Well, nice. We do a little movie and plane segue here at the end. I like planes.
Little aeronautics.
Yeah. Now I want to see Top Gun and then talk about it.
There you go. Tom Cruise Going Fast, the movie.
Yes. Well, this one is Tom Cruise teaches other people to go fast, the movie. Because I think he's brought back as like a instructor and they need to get new Top Gun pilots to do this super tough mission.
You know, if you like action movies, Neuro, and I'm not saying you should do this, but if you like action movies, India right now is going through an 80s action movie phase. So Bollywood is pumping out a lot of really over-the-top action movies that are very similar in style to 1980s American action movies. So if you're in the mood for some action, you know, check out Top Gun and whatnot, but you might also look to see what's going on in India, because you might see something you like there, or at least something that's memorable.
Mm-hmm.
Even the trailers I've seen are memorable. I don't know if anybody still remembers IMDb. I don't know if that's still like the main movie site anymore, like it was back in my day, but sometimes I'll pop back and try to look at, you know, trailers and stuff to see what's new. And I've noticed that they've got some kind of development deal with Bollywood, because I've noticed there's a lot of Bollywood movies that have trailers listed on the site now. So I've actually seen a few of these, and yeah, they're very colorful, to put it mildly.
Bollywood Roadhouse. Let's go.
Fun stuff.
Well, cool. Thank you for coming on as always. I was a little bit hot and sleepy, so thank you for carrying today with some of that.
No problem. You know, thank you for having me. Always a privilege.
I'll try to remember to publish the VOD after this so you can read the chat and see what people had to say. We will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. See you next time.
Nice.